welcome to everybody joining us from Zoom. I am Derek with B&H, and joining me are Kevin Rickert from B&H and Rudy Winston from Canon. So I want to welcome you guys on. Thank you for coming on. It's a big release, Rudy. I know there's a lot of excitement floating around Canon and just the photography world in general with people who have been anticipating the release of these cameras. So welcome to you guys. I'll let you introduce yourself. Kevin, you're there live in the B&H Superstore, so I'm going to kick it over to you real quick. Just introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about you.
Yeah, sure. I'm Kevin Rickert. I am here in the B&H Superstore. I am the photo trainer, so therefore I'm the one who has to facilitate all this new information from Canon to the employees, and the employees are knowledgeable on helping the customers, so they are aware. As far as myself, besides being a sales trainer, I'm a big photographer as far as like travel photographer, street photographer out in New York City, going around the world and stuff like that on my spare time. And yeah, that's what I do.
Awesome. And Rudy, welcome. Thank you so much. It was so exciting yesterday, playing a role in the release of these cameras. Tell us a little bit about yourself and we'll get everything started.
Well, that's a pleasure. My name is Rudy Winston. I'm a technical advisor at Canon USA, and my specialty is still cameras. And while certainly we've had to get up to speed on video over the years, that's always been my background. And I've been with Canon for 23 years, and I can tell you in that time I have never seen a new product introduction that has gotten so much attention and engendered so much enthusiasm as this one has here in 2020. So we are really riding the wave and looking forward to it. And I want to thank B&H and B&H's customer base for this opportunity.
Thank you so much. And thank you for joining us, Rudy. I think you hit the nail on the head. Based on the questions that we received, I have a football field worth of questions here for people who just have so many different questions relating to the specs of the camera, how the camera stacks up, where it fits into the Canon line. And, you said you have been a stills guy your whole life. Now, we talked a little bit about it yesterday where every still photographer is getting to the point where you have to learn video or you have to at least be comfortable with it. So let's start there. The video, beyond impressive. 8K, that's all you got to say, 8K. So can you talk to us a little bit about the video capabilities of both the R5 and the R6?
Well, one thing we want to make sure of is that the pretty strong capabilities of the R6 don't get lost in the shuffle with all the excitement generated by the R5. Now, certainly, the 8K capability in the R5 is, one of its signature features. It's the first interchangeable lens camera in a still camera form factor to offer in-camera 8K. And you have the choice, of course, of raw 8K recording to the CF Express card in the camera, or 8K in all-I or IPB compression. And that can be at 24 frames a second or 30 frames a second. And it can be your choice of a UHD aspect ratio, a 16:9 aspect ratio, or the cinema-based DCI aspect ratio, which is a little longer rectangle, 17:9. You can pick those as you're choosing your choice of resolutions and frame rates. Wow. And as we understood yesterday, I'm going to say wow a lot today. I'm just, putting it out there right now for everyone. There's a lot of very impressive features. We're talking uncropped, right? Yes. 8K uncropped. Yes, absolutely. The UHD has to come in a little bit, but we're not talking crop from a central portion of the sensor or anything like that. And I want to make clear that because there is a little bit of a misconception out there on the R5 and the R6 that somehow, especially at the lower resolutions, that we don't have 24 frames a second. I want to assure everybody that's not the case. You have 24 frames a second capability in full HD and in 4K on both cameras. And you brought up a great point before, Rudy, when we're talking about the R5 and the R6. And I think the first assumption, which would be a very wrong assumption of a lot of people, is to assume that you have the R5 on one level and the R6 on another level. And they're very much eye to eye. It's not even like a older sibling, younger sibling kind of, it's twins. In a lot of, when you're looking at the specs, they're very similar in a lot of ways. And I think a lot of people get thrown by the megapixel count and they don't look at the packages as a whole.
That's one of the intriguing things about these two cameras as a pair, is how many aspects of their design and operation they share that are either identical or nearly identical. And obviously there are going to be some differences too, but it's from the design and operation of the camera with, you know, the 3-dial operation, that you can work the camera essentially with your right hand when you're shooting with the viewfinder, to things like the autofocus system, which is absolutely identical in the two cameras. It's not like you're getting more performance out of one than the other. The shooting speeds for still images, 12 frames a second max with the mechanical or first curtain electronic shutter, 20 frames a second with the electronic shutter. Those are identical between the two cameras. So there's a, you know, to your point, there is an awful lot that is the same or virtually the same on the two cameras. But of course, there are some deviations too, where they, you know, go their separate ways and bring separate strengths to the table.
Now you talked about the frame rate. So obviously on both cameras, you're looking at 20 frames per second on the electronic shutter and 12 frames per second mechanical shutter. Going into the electronic shutter, a lot of the questions that came in were regarding that 20 frames per second. And are we looking at blackout time? Are we looking at a lag? Are we looking at any dragging of the electronic shutter?
No, it's refreshingly free from any blackout in the viewfinder or the LCD screen if you're using that. You can see like a little bit of a jittering, but it's not, there is absolutely no blackout. There is no slideshow effect during 20 frame a second shooting with the electronic shutter. You do get the flashing white border around the edges of the image each time the shutter fires, because of course it's silent and there is no tactile sensation that it's fired. So that's your cue that yes, the shutter fired here. But in that regard, it's a pretty smooth operation. Now, one of the things I think that, I don't want to jump ahead here, but one of the things that we may be asked about is with the electronic shutter, you know, about its scan rates and so on. Now, both of these imaging sensors are new. The sensor in the R6, the 20 million pixel sensor, is based on the sensor that's in the 1DX Mark III camera, which we just introduced earlier this year. That's a brand new sensor design where the hardware is designed for operational speed. And the same is absolutely true for the 45 million pixel sensor in the R5 camera. Both of these sensors, the hardware is totally new, and operational speed, scanning speed, was one of the major priorities in this system. Now, the engineers did not give us a scan rate or a scan speed number. Well, it scans in, you know, blank fractions of a second or whatever. So I don't have a number to give you. But in terms of rolling shutter effect for stills and for video, we're pretty confident that it's going to be a noticeable step forward from where we were with the EOS R and RP cameras.
See, Rudy, you know, you said you didn't want to jump ahead. We're going to be all over the place. We're going to be going video, back to sensors, to this camera, to that camera. You just, you know, you answered so many questions that I saw come in right there. So see, I told you, I'm like, everybody, I trusted Rudy. I said, Rudy, this is your thing. Do your thing. A wealth of information. So again, can't thank you enough for being on here.
I'm honored.
Now, as we said before we went live today, you know, a lot of what was coming in as far as the conversation and the questions from our customers are comparing it to the rest of Canon's line. So we're seeing a lot of questions and comparisons regarding the 5DS, regarding the 1DX Mark III. If you can, you know, go off script a little here. If you want to talk more experiential, you know, you can throw some specs in. But from what you've seen, where is the R5 and the R6 stacking up, you know, against the 5D line, the 1DX line? We had a lot of people that are asking, is this the right camera for me? What is the right camera for me based on what I do?
Well, let me preface the answer by saying this. There's actually a couple of things I could say, but let me start with this. The R6 and the R5 are a fusion of design excellence, processing power, and performance that we simply haven't seen at Canon before, certainly not in the mirrorless camera field. And the R5 in particular, you know, when you look at that camera as a 45 million pixel full frame camera with absolutely marvelous image quality, this is a camera that can shoot 20 frames a second with the best autofocus we have ever put into a camera. So the fusion of performance and image quality is something we've simply never had at Canon before. And I think a lot of people are going to look at both the R5 and the R6 and say that, you know, these may be the right answer for me. Certainly, in terms of the performance punch that they pack, it's a huge step forward for us in the mirrorless field. The EOS RP and the R are going to remain important cogs in the lineup. You know, with the EOS R, for instance, you're still talking a 30 million pixel camera of, you know, with a definite track record now of, you know, good reliability, good image quality, and it's going to remain a value proposition in our system, especially for folks that are, you know, working on a budget or whatever. The same is, of course, true with the EOS RP full frame camera. But these two, the R6 and the R5, you know, really raise the bar. Now, that being said, one of the interesting things is to compare these two cameras to the EOS 1DX Mark III. Now, the 1DX Mark III, of course, is a $6,500 camera, roughly. And it's certainly, you know, much bigger and so on. And a lot of people would rule it out just because of the cost factor and or the size and weight. But in spite of the absolutely magnificent performance and features that the two new cameras, the R6 and the R5, bring to our customers, there are still valid reasons that a customer might decide that the 1DX Mark III is the better way for them to go in terms of a combination of extreme performance, extreme physical durability and strength and reliability and weather resistance. And then on top of that, the best burst rate, continuous shooting at 14 frames a second through the viewfinder and up to 20 frames a second using the LCD monitor. The burst rate and the battery life on the 1DX Mark III are just on another plane altogether. So for customers for whom those are going to be very important attributes, those are still valid reasons to consider the 1DX Mark III. And, you know, we understand the digital SLR still has a lot of traction in the marketplace and in the Canon customer base. So we know there are thousands and thousands of people out there working with Canon DSLRs, 5D series, 6D series, 7D series, and so on. And, you know, many of them I think are going to be attracted to what these new cameras offer, but I understand for those who say, you know, I still like the DSLR. I get it.
No, I mean, and it's understandable. I think everybody, you know, mirrorless is fairly new on the scene, I guess you could say, as far as from a professional standpoint. I know a lot of people were comfortable with DSLRs for their entire life. And then mirrorless comes on the scene and it's like, all right, well, we don't know if it's there yet. We don't know if it's there yet. We don't know if it's there yet. You see everybody else taking it seriously. And, you know, it's been a slow transition for a lot of people. So these are valid questions that people have. Now, Kevin, I want to bring you in. So you got your hands on the new cameras. And as we all know, you get your hands on new gear. What's the first thing you got to do before you can play with it? You got to charge the batteries. So we had a lot of questions come in on, you know, new battery. Is it working with the old batteries, chargers? What's the situation as far as batteries are concerned?
Yeah, so when I received these cameras yesterday, the R5 and the R6, you know, batteries were in charge. So in a pinch, being B&H with a, you know, LPE6s everywhere, that was the solution. So the charger is the same charger as that was prior, the LCE6 charger that was in the prior cameras that took that battery. And honestly, for when I was walking around the city, we used the LPE6, not the newer version, the LPE6NH, which has a little bit more milliamp hours to support these cameras. But the LPE6 original one worked fine throughout the day. And I got, you know, taking pictures on both cameras because I only had one battery. So I was going from the R5 and R6, R5, R6 throughout the day. And I pretty much got almost 1,000 pictures, a little bit more on both cameras. So it lasted throughout the day. It was like only at 2 bars, which is good. So everybody can rest assured that if they have a 5D Mark III, 5D Mark IV, the batteries that they have could supplement what comes in this one.
And Kevin, I want to stay with you there because I know you did take the camera out. You are a photographer yourself. Mm-hmm. And in addition to being a photographer, as you stated earlier, you do training on these cameras for B&H employees.
Yes.
So you are the guy that we come to when, you know, there's new Canon gear, and all of us at B&H have to get on the same page and have to be updated with everything. What is your experience like? Again, you were out with the camera. I want to know ergonomics. How did the camera feel in your hands? How did the camera, you know, weight distribution? What was the operational aspect of it like?
Yeah, so one of the first things you realize when you pick up these cameras is like the weight distribution. That's one of the major things, even with the original EOS R, was picking that camera up, having a 7200 on it, and it feeling like almost like a feather because the rear element is closer to the mount. So it has this weightlessness to it. It feels so good in the hand. And the R5 and the R6 kind of take that idea and just extend it a little bit better. The R5 feels great in the hand. It's just well balanced with the top LCD. The R6 has a little bit of a different grip. It's subtle, but when you're walking around, you can feel it's a little bit thicker in the grip, but comparatively, the bodies are a little bit different. One thing to mention is there was a lot of people, I remember when Canon first launched their EOS R, they had the multifunction bar. And a lot of people were just like, this is interesting. They are no longer on this camera. Canon did a good job of listening to a lot of photographers, and they went to a traditional joystick, which a lot of people do love. It's more at home for them. It feels like they're older 5D Mark IIIs and 1DXs and stuff like that. One thing to note about the R5 and R6 is that here's the R5, and you have the top LCD and the newer mode dial over here. And then on the R6, you do have the regular mode dial over here. And just so you know, here's the back of it. So there's no multifunction bar there. Same thing with the R5. Yeah, but as far as just shooting, it's a breeze. It's one of the best, because the mirrorless cameras, you know, dealing with a lot of customers and a lot of employees, they're like, oh, mirrorless cameras feel like toys. And that's one of the misconceptions that you have to get out there. Like, now this is a robust camera. They're weather sealed, both of them. It's not like, oh, the R5 is and the R6 isn't. They're both on the same level with each other, which Canon did a really good job not differentiating them too far apart from each other. And honestly, if someone doesn't want 45 megapixels or the 8K, the R6 is really good for the wedding photographer who may not have like that large hard drive or the setup to hold all that. So they're very, very capable cameras, and they both feel good in hands.
Yeah, and a lot of questions that we saw come in, Kevin, were from wedding photographers. I mean, this is a camera that instantly, when you look at it, wedding photographers come to mind because it's so capable, it's so fast, it's so powerful, and it really has all of the makings of a camera that it would be a wedding photographer's dream. Now, Rudy, we all know it's all about the glass, right? So a lot of people say glass is king. And if you're going to have a body or two bodies that are this capable, you really want to have superior glass on there. So if you could talk to us a little bit about the line of lenses, and not only that, but a lot of people had questions about their older EF lenses. So when we talk about in terms of image stabilization, are people who are using EF lenses with the converter, are we getting the same benefits as the RF lenses?
We've got basically three different questions, so to speak, in what you just said, and I'd like to address each of those. Starting with the ability to use your EF or even EFS lenses on the EOS R system cameras. This applies equally to any of the cameras, the RP, the R, and now the R6 and the R5. We have the three lens mount adapters, EF to EOS R lens mount adapters that will allow you to take any of the lenses for EOS digital SLRs and use them seamlessly on these cameras. If you attach an EFS lens, it'll automatically crop the image to cover the APS-C size area of the imaging sensor. It knows when you put the lens on that it's an EFS lens. More to the point though, for our full frame digital SLR users who are using EF lenses or even tilt shift lenses and so on, these will work like a dream. autofocus in the case of those lenses that have it. Obviously, TSE lenses don't have autofocus, but autofocus is going to be at the same level of performance that it would have been on cameras like your 5D series or your 6D series or whatever. And this is something people don't want to, people sort of think, oh, well, there must be a catch. You know, I've heard so many negative things about lens mount adapters. And yeah, you can run into some kind of quirky behaviors and so on when you take camera A and take lens from company B and then use a mount adapter from company C and try to get them to all work together seamlessly. Yeah, we know there've been problems there. But when it's all in the family here, so to speak. You take a Canon EF or EFS lens and put it on an EOS R body with the Canon mount adapter, it is about as seamless a transition as you can have. There's no loss of exposure functionality. It's not like you got to shoot manual or anything. As I said, your focusing system continues to work. So I want to just make that clear right from the outset. Secondly, in terms of, you know, you started out by saying it's all with the glass. We certainly have had for 3 decades a marvelous reputation building the EF lens series in terms of outstanding image quality. And I just said you can continue to use those lenses on any of the EOS R system cameras, including the new R5 and R6. And the image stabilization, which we now have in the camera body, the so-called IBIS, or In Body Stabilization, for the first time on an EOS camera, that is going to breathe new life into some of the EF lenses that customers may own now. I've played with it with lenses like one of my favorites, the EF 135mm f2, which is just a tremendously sharp lens, but it doesn't have stabilization in the lens. The fact that you now have it on the camera body opens up some neat doors for lower light shooting with lenses like that. And any lens that doesn't have stabilization built in, that IBIS system is really going to throw a new dimension into what you can do in terms of hand holding in less than ideal lighting conditions. Now, finally, getting to the first thing that you said, you know, glass is king in the eyes of many, many customers. With the EOS R series, we have launched from the beginning the EOS RF lenses. And these, it's clear, our engineers were swinging for the fences when they designed some of these. And we've got some lenses here that are just simply spectacular. The whole fusion of the mirrorless form factor, a large lens mount, the ability to put it closer to the imaging sensor than we could have with digital SLRs, has totally changed the playing field in terms of lens design. And we are seeing the benefits of that. You know, starting with lenses that came out with the launch of the original EOS R, lenses like the 50mm f1.2, without question, the best 50mm lens we've ever made. It's not even close. You know, we followed that up with lenses like the 28-70 f2, you know, and some other spectacular professional grade lenses, the 15-35 f2.8 zoom, a new image stabilized 24-70 f2.8, and that marvelous 70-200 that's nearly a pound lighter than previous 70-200 millimeter f2.8 lenses and is at least as sharp as the very highly regarded EF version. So the RF lens series has really been rocking, and we've obviously introduced some new lenses that are coming out with the R5 and R6 camera that we're very excited about as well. But yeah, I agree with you. Glass is king. The beauty is you can take all the goodness, if you're a Canon customer, you can take all the goodness that you've been using up to now and continue to go right on using it just with one of the mount adapters.
And it's that idea, like you said, it's an ecosystem. It's really building great gear, and then when you're building, you know, and when you're redesigning, re-engineering new gear that's going to be just as functional at a maximum capacity with the older than it is with the newer. So now I hope you guys are ready. Kevin, Rudy, we're going to get to some questions here. So we're going to get to some pointed questions. We have asked our customers what everybody wants to see and what they want to hear answers on. So we're going to get started here with John W. So John sent in the question. He is a wedding photographer. Now, he's excited about the cameras, doesn't do much video, but he wants to know about the build quality. And in particular, is the R6, does it have a substantially lower build quality than the R5? How do they compare?
Kevin, you want to take that or you want me to?
Yeah, I'll take it because I had time with both of them. Honestly, you can't really, besides the grip on the R6 and the R5, you can't really, they built very, very well. It's, I can't see a difference. Both of them are weather sealed, so you can take it anywhere you so desire, honestly. When it comes down to it, I don't think, honestly, having them both here in front of me, there's not a substantial difference in the build quality. They both built very well. The only thing you can see the difference is one has the mode dial, the other one has the newer type, which you have to press a button and rotate. And the top LCD screen tells you the different modes that you're in. And since you don't do video, I'm not going to tell you what you have to do to get the video, but essentially it's a different step as opposed to just rotating the mode dial to like aperture priority, manual, bulb, so on and so forth. But honestly, the build on these is just top notch, honestly.
Now, Rudy, I'm going to kick back to you for the next question. Kenneth was asking about the electronic shutter scanning speed and whether that has been improved. He says he's used the EOS R on movie sets and in silent mode exclusively, and the shutter scan speed is somewhat slow. So he said about 1/15 of a second, which can cause some artifacts with movement and also some lights. Can you talk about any upgrades to the shutter speed scanning?
Yeah, I'm going to repeat something I said at the outset, that, you know, one of the big changes on these cameras is the speed of the hardware. And in particular, I am talking the imaging sensors. While they are not the so-called global shutter sensors, they do still scan the surface of the sensor to record image data. They do it at a much faster rate than what we had with the 5D Mark IV, if you were using that in live view, or with the EOS Rs, which basically used a very similar sensor. So you're going to see a difference. Now, I think I said this already. The engineers at Canon did not give us a number in terms of, okay, total scanning speed is about, you know, 1 over whatever of a second. I don't have a number to give you. But, you know, we can say, at least anecdotally, based on what we've seen with pre-production cameras, that there is definitely going to be an improvement there compared to where we were with the EOS R and RP cameras.
Wonderful. Kevin, Izzy wants to know if the R5 has focus bracketing built in.
I can check that right now. So I'll have the camera right here. I mean, it'd be weird that it wouldn't. There's a lot of things that people have been asking, and I've noticed, like on my own end, as soon as the camera launched, I had to do a lot of, you know, questions for everybody. Like people were asking if it had an intervalometer. Yes, it does. Does it have zebra? Yes, it does. Does it have focus peaking? Yes, it does. So can you record on 2 memory cards? Yes, you can. Let me see here. Focus bracketing. We say focus bracketing, right?
Focus bracketing, yep.
Yeah. Let's see. Thing is here, it's like getting used to the whole menu system. You can come back to me. Unless, Rudy, you know where it is.
I can tell you both cameras have it.
Yeah.
There you go.
There we go.
There we go.
Instead of looking for it, but yeah, there's a definitive answer. But everything else, like I said, like intervalometer, zebras, peaking, it's all there. You can record on 2 different memory cards. That was a loud noise. But for the most part, it's all of them are here. The menu, getting used to the menu system, but I tell people all the time, Canon's probably the easiest to deal with. It's all color-coded. You can just go through the joystick and pick through things. It's really, 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 really simple. And especially if someone's been shooting Canon for 15, 10, 20 years, you're at home here.
Kevin, Norma did ask that. Norma wanted to know about the menu system. Has anything changed?
I think it's more simplified actually right now. It's very like some other cameras. They have like the whole. You have to scroll to the bottom of it. Like if you go to the menu over here, I can see it. I'll show you on here. It's very. Sometimes you have like 1 or 2 items per. I don't know if it's focus, but you have 1 or 2 items per. Not a little tab over here, and so it makes it really like concise when you go through it. Like autofocus has their own. It probably went away. There it goes. Menu. It's a little, there we go. I know why it's doing that, because it's seeing the viewfinder. But yeah, whatever. But yeah, it's very concise. And then you also have the quick menu on here, so you can just press the Q button, change your settings on the fly like that. And it's touchscreen in the menus too, which makes things a little bit easier if you want to go just 1, 2, 3.
Okay. And Rudy, we've had a lot of talk about the low light capabilities, the ISO. Craig W. wants to know specifically, how is the low light capability? What are we looking at? And how does that compare to the 1DX Mark II or Mark III?
The R6 camera, since it uses the same processor and virtually the same imaging sensor as the 1DX Mark III, not Mark II, but the Mark III, the new one, the high ISO noise we expect is going to be a strong point on the R6 camera. Now, again, I've only had the privilege of shooting with pre-production cameras, and we know better than to make final conclusions on image quality on pre-production cameras. That said, everything I've seen up to now really leads me to be extremely optimistic. Now, in the case of the higher resolution R5, anytime we're talking higher resolution imaging sensors, here more than twice as many pixels, 45 million pixels versus 20, the pixels by definition have to be smaller, and all else being equal, that normally means they're going to be a little less sensitive to light, and you're not going to get quite the same level of high ISO noise resistance, so to speak, that you would with a lower resolution sensor. That said, there is in particular a marked difference in noise and so on, tonal range and detail with this if we compare it, at least superficially, to the 50 million pixel EOS 5DS and 5DSR cameras, which we came out with back in 2015. A lot of our pros are still using those very effectively, but there is a big improvement in terms of high ISO noise with the new imaging system, not just sensor, but the whole system in the R5 camera. So yeah, noise is an area where I think people are going to see some neat improvements, and the noise champion here should be the R6 camera. That should really be the low light king.
So Kevin, I'm going to bring you in here. We had a question come in from Facebook, and Rudy, I want you on standby because I want Kevin's point of view on this from when you were out shooting with the camera. And then Rudy, if you have some hard numbers or a little bit, if you want to piggyback on this, we had a question come in on Facebook about battery life. So the question was in particular to shooting 8K raw video and what the battery life is like. But Kevin, if you can expand upon your experience with shooting the camera, every photographer pays attention to it, how quick their battery is dying, how long their battery is lasting, and how hinged upon different features this is. So with all the technology, obviously cameras are going to be using more battery. What was your experience like out in the field, Kevin?
All right, so I was around just taking pictures in around the Hudson Yards area. On both cameras, I used the older LPE6 battery, which is from the 5D Mark III for such like that, which is a little bit of a lower, I think it's 1800 milliamp hours as opposed to the new one, which is around 22, 23. But I've taken like almost 1,000 pictures during the day, and that's in shooting RAW and JPEG on both cameras. I was only at 2 bars, so I used like 50% of the battery, and it still had some juice. I was, had to play with the camera a little bit more, so I had to charge the other batteries, the newer ones, which are both installed to the camera right now. But the battery life, I know I've seen the CIPA rating, and it was like 320, but that's always on the different, they measure things differently with the EVF on. So, I mean, I shot from, let's say 12:30 to around 3:30, and I was at 50%, and I was just blind firing, just taking a bunch of shots in the area, going to the vessel, and didn't have any issues. I know that, so if you use a viewfinder more, it's going to drain it a little bit quicker. It's going to be, obviously, if you're doing videos, it's drain it a little bit quicker. That's the rule of the game. But for the most part, the battery life was fine. It was not, I shot a lot of mirrorless cameras, and I was comfortable with this. And obviously, the way I do things, I always have an extra battery. And these batteries are very common, especially if you have like an older Canon camera. So you'll have like one battery in your back pocket and you'll be fine.
So Rudy, as Kevin said, you can use the older battery, but obviously you upgrading the body, upgrading the camera, why are the battery, why not get more juice out of it? So what are we looking at as far as the new battery performance?
Well, Kevin's experience, I think, speaks to the fact that in real life terms, I think many photographers across the spectrum of brands and so on can agree that typically in real life situations, they tend to get more in the way of either video recording time or number of still image shots on a battery charge than the SEPA industry standard test numbers would indicate. That being said, the only empirical data I can give you to second what Kevin said are SEPA official test numbers from our engineers at Canon. The original question I asked was, in 8K video, what is the estimated battery life? And the official number we're giving, again, this is a SEPA test number, so your mileage may vary, as the saying used to go. We're saying 1 hour and 20 minutes on a fully charged LPE6 NH battery, the new higher performance battery. 1 hour and 20 minutes at 8K. At 1080p, they're saying 2 hours and 20 minutes on a single fully charged battery. And for still images, if we're using the high refresh rate in the electronic viewfinder, so in other words, I'm giving you a worst case scenario in terms of battery life numbers here. The SEPA numbers say 200 shots on the R5 camera, and on the R6 camera, about 250 shots. Now again, that's typically worst case scenario, and real world, I think most people's experience is going to come much closer to mirroring what Kevin experienced. And frankly, anecdotally, I've experienced very similar type of things, shooting, over 200 pictures and, being down to, like 60 or 70% of the battery remaining, where, the official specs say, we should be near depletion. So, but anyway, those are the real numbers, the official numbers that I can give you.
Okay. And I'm going to stick with video for a second here, because we did have a lot of questions come in on the other aspect of video that we haven't really touched upon, but is just as instrumental, if not more important in some circumstances, and that's audio capabilities. And we had a couple of questions. So David answered a question, and we have one that came in on Facebook as well. David wants to know, particularly to the R5, does it record audio when shooting in 4K at 60p or 120p? And then we had a question in general on Facebook as far as any changes to the audio preamps, or was there any beefing up of the audio system?
You take the last one first. We're not aware, based on the technical information we've received from Japan, that there are any fundamental differences in the way sound audio is recorded during video on these cameras. So I don't want to mislead and have people thinking that, oh, there's a huge upgrade in terms of the recording capability or whatever. We're still talking input in through a single pin stereo jack, and so it's going to be pretty similar, I think, to what people are used to with the EOS R, 5D series, and so on. Let's see, I lost my train of thought. What was the first part of the question?
So David had asked about the R5, whether it records audio when shooting in 4K at 60p and 120p.
Yeah, 120p is considered high frame rate recording, and in fact, it's a separate line item in the menu. It's not just one of the ordinary menu choices for combination of resolution and frames per second rate and so on. So it's a separate line item. Like our previous cameras, 120 frames a second in 4K is done silently. There is no sound recording. Now, we're aware that there are a lot of customers who'd like to see that, and we will continue to feed that information back to our engineers. But as it sits right now, with both cameras, the 120 frames a second, 4K in the case of the R5, full HD in the case of the R6, that's without sound. You do absolutely have sound recording, and for what it's worth, autofocus, if you go 4K 60p on either camera.
Okay. And Justin Bristol, who is watching us, hello, Justin, you have the question of the day of the week. When is it shipping? When can people expect to have these in their hands?
Again, the team at B&H may have received even more recent information from Canon's sales team. I'm not part of a sales team, so I'm speaking a little out of turn here, but the latest I've heard is that the R5, the 45 million pixel camera, should be arriving at dealers late in July. and the R6 should be arriving at dealers mid to late August. We'll see. Just, obviously 2020 has been a heck of a year in a lot of ways. I don't think I need to elaborate. So, we'll see if any difficulties, intrude on that. But that's the plan as I understand right now.
Perfect. Yeah, I think that's the understatement of the century right there. It's been a whopper of a year. Kevin, a lot of questions coming in on Facebook as well about the dynamic range capabilities of these cameras. So if you could, touch upon what you noticed with the dynamic range.
When it comes to dynamic range, I took some high contrast shots yesterday, of the skyline around 4 o'clock, 5 o'clock. It holds up from what, can't put an exact number on it, but from what I see in the camera, and if you're talking about a computer, it's on par. I have no straight number, and also I did some research prior to actually the cameras in my hand to see if there was an actual number. Canon didn't release a number. I think Rudy could attest to that. They didn't put any numbers on that yet. We have to see any third-party company, especially for video, to see if they come out and say, oh, it's going to be 12 or 15 or such like that. But the dynamic range, as far as what I saw in the R6 and on the R5, was very, very good. It's on par with anything else that's out there, and if not better.
Rudy, is there anything you wanted to add to that?
Sure. I know in spite of many in the general public longing to have, a quantifiable number to define dynamic range in our still cameras, Canon engineers have never given us that, and this is no exception. The one thing they did say is that they expect that the dynamic range is going to be about a stop greater than what we've had with the EOS R and the 5D Mark IV and similar cameras. So, we expect to see some improvements. Exactly where they fall on a numerical scale is going to depend on whose scale, who's doing the measuring, and I'll leave it to smarter people than me in terms of independent reviewers and so on to, give their quantified judgments and so on once production cameras have, gone out in the world.
I'm going to stick with you, Rudy. We've had a couple questions come in. Randall specifically asked about GPS. If the R5 has GPS built in, there's a lot of people who they go out adventuring or going out into the middle of the desert and they want to have their photos GPS tracked.
It does not, and I think part of the reason that it doesn't is because we've had, and these two cameras continue to have, the ability with Wi-Fi to gather GPS data from a smartphone. So as long as you've got a smartphone or a tablet, I guess, that it can get GPS through Bluetooth, it can bring the GPS information in that way. But the short answer is they don't have GPS capability built in. Now, we do have an optional Canon GPS device, the GPE2 receiver, which can be used. It fits on the Achu of the camera, and that can be used as well to get GPS information.
Yeah, that's always something a conversation that comes up when you have, let's face it, a lot of photographers love to travel. A lot of times they're off the beaten path. They're out in the middle of nowhere. And GPS is something that, whether a lot of people realize or not, it takes an incredible amount of battery life out of your battery. So a system like this, I think I look at it in terms of, some people might say, I love the GPS, I have to have it. But I look at it from the perspective of, hey, I do have an option. Everybody carries a smart device now. I do have the option to still get that data at much less of a draining cost to my battery life, which I think is a worthy sacrifice.
That's a good point.
So, and Anne has a question. So Anne is asking about the megapixel count, and more particularly about going from the 30 megapixels of the R down to the 20 megapixels of the R6. So if you could just talk a little bit about, we always get into it. It's one of the keystone conversations of photography in general is megapixels. So a lot of people have asked about megapixel count, pixel peaking. Where are we looking at, with this 20 megapixels? Can you give people more of like a real world, like, hey, you can print it this big?
Yeah, absolutely. Just doing the arithmetic at 300 DPI, you can make a straight print virtually 13 by 19 inches in size. That's with like practically no interpolation of the file. If you literally do it with no interpolation of the file, no expanding of the file in Photoshop or whatever print application you're using, then it ends up being like an inch less in both dimensions. Now, anyone who's done any degree of printing understands that you can go beyond just literally a pixel for pixel reproduction. You can expand the file up to a point. There's a finite limit, but we're not saying that the 20 million pixels in a camera like the R6 makes it ideal for 4 by 6 foot wall decor prints where fine detail is important. But certainly you got a camera, and I think anybody who shot with a 20 or 24 million pixel camera can vouch for this. You've got a camera that can easily do 20 by 30 inch prints that'll hold up extremely nicely under scrutiny. So again, though, think about it. If you just literally print without expansion, you're talking virtually a 13 by 19 inch print. That's with no expansion of the file whatsoever.
Yeah, we had Canon sponsored photographer Jeff Cable on last night in the virtual event space, and he was talking about how with 45 megapixels it allows him the ability. A lot of what he's shooting, he's out on safaris and has to crop down. So that 45 megapixels is great for people who are shooting content similar to that where you have to crop a lot. But if you're not someone who feels the need to crop, really, 45 megapixels it's great. More is always better, but 20 in this day and age, like you said, is very substantial and more than enough for probably 99% of the people out there who own cameras.
I'll give you another perspective just very quickly on 20 million pixels. Again, just simply doing the math. That is more than enough information, again, with no expansion of the file to do a double page spread in a magazine.
Yes.
8.5 by 11 inches per page.
It's always good to have real world, when you put it out there and people can see it in real terms, like, oh, you know what? Yeah, that doesn't sound too bad when you put it like that. Now, Kevin, I want to talk about memory cards. We've had a lot of questions coming in about write speed. Is there a lag? Is it the same memory card slot on both cameras? And Rudy, feel free to jump back and forth with Kevin on this. We also had a question regarding, can you write to both cameras both card slots simultaneously?
So I have the R5 right here. The R5, from what people want to know, is 2 card slots right there. One, let me pop it up. It's going to be a CF Express card. This is a SanDisk one in here. And also the other slot is a SD UHS-2 card slot. So this is a Pro grade, as you see, has 2 rows of contacts there, which are both fast cards. If I recommend, this is one of the things that as a trainer you have to be aware of, is that when our staff recommends this to customers, if you're listening in and want to purchase this, if you're on the R5, if you're going to do anything 8K or anything high speed, at the 45 megapixels and RAW and such like that, definitely recommend the CF Express card. It has the better speeds to handle this. And when you go into video settings, it actually tells you, like, this won't be able to be recorded on an SD card. You need a CF Express card to record an 8K RAW internally and such like that. I noticed that out the bat yesterday. The R6 is a little bit more traditional, I guess. It has 2 SD UHS-2 card slots. So this is their, once again, UHS-2, and it has 2 card slots right there. And you can actually go into the menu and say you want to record to both simultaneously. It gives you the option on both cameras. Because I saw someone ask that question, I was like, let me just deep dive into the menu, and it gives you that recording option. It goes, you want to record both, you want to go overflow, so on and so forth. So that's not something that Canon was going to get rid of. That's an important thing for like wedding photographers. That's why you had the 2 card slots. You want to be certain that it recorded to both cards and you're safe. You have a backup on the fly. So that's how the memory card situation is. Once again, if any of you are doing anything high speed on the R5, CF Express, anything else on the R6, you have to go with a SD card. But once again, I recommend the higher speed cards for situations like this.
Speaking of on the fly, we have a question from Marty McFly, joining us from the future on Facebook. Marty wants to know, will the RF 28 to 70 millimeter have 8 stops of IBIS when used with the R5? Is it better to have a lens with the image stabilization built in, Rudy?
Canon actually released just at the 11th hour a list of SEPA ratings for RF lenses with and without their own optical stabilization when you use them in combination with the built-in image stabilization, the IBIS system, if you will, on the R5 and the R6 cameras. And just real quickly, I want to say parenthetically, the IBIS system in the R6 and the R5 is identical. It's not that one performs better than the other or whatever. I don't recall what the number of stops correction officially the SEPA rating was on the 28 to 70 millimeter f2 lens. It's definitely going to be an improvement over what you could do hand holding without stabilization, because of course that lens did not have optical stabilization in the lens itself. Real quick, if I can just take a second here, because I know that just in the past day, in the past 24 hours and change, there's been a lot of discussion online and so on, not just on B&H, but throughout the industry about the IBIS system and what'll it do, will it work? And, you know, we've tried to be transparent and clear about that. But again, in the preliminary information, there's only so much you can get out. So let me just real quickly give a 30,000 foot overview. With the two new cameras, the R6 and the R5, there is built-in 5-axis image stabilization that literally moves the imaging sensor. It's a true IBIS system. It's not digital stabilization that's moving the electronic image on the sensor or whatever. Let's be clear about that. You could, any lens you attach, whether it's an EF lens from the DSLR system with an adapter or an RF lens that just simply doesn't have optical stabilization. Any lens without stabilization, you can turn it on in the menu. The camera's smart enough to know when you attach a lens, okay, does it or does it not have image stabilization? If it doesn't, a menu item appears in the red shooting menu, image stabilization mode. You can go in there and turn stabilization on, and you will get a stabilized effect. And it'll definitely be an improvement over what you would have gotten without it. Now, the degree of stabilization is going to depend to a large extent on the lens we're talking about and so on. The number of stops correction is going to vary depending on the lens's characteristics and that kind of thing, even though it doesn't have stabilization in it in this example. But the IBIS system works very nicely, and it's going to expand what you can do with your lenses handheld for stills and for video shooting in any lens you attach without stabilization. Okay, so that's one. Number two is if you take an EF lens or an EFS lens with the mount adapter that has optical stabilization. The system right away is smart enough to know when you attach that lens, yes, this lens has image stabilization built into it. So now there isn't a menu item in the red shooting menu. Instead, the lens's own IS switch, its on-off switch, now dictates whether or not you have a combination of the lens's optical stabilization and the IBIS stabilization working simultaneously. Turn it on, they both work. Turn it off, they both shut off. There is no way to go in and turn just the IBIS on or just the lens's stabilization on. It's either they both go on in tandem or they're both off. With them both on, you are going to get superior correction performance compared to what you would have gotten with that lens's optical IS by itself. So once again, you've added even more corrective capability to lenses just randomly. Lenses like the EF 70 to 200 f2.8 with image stabilization, the 100 to 400 L series lens with image stabilization, or any other IS lens, regardless of its focal length. Then finally, the third possibility is an RF lens that has optical stabilization. Now you are going to get a different combination of the way the IBIS system with the 5-axis stabilization and the lens's stabilization work together. And the engineers call this coordinated IS. Once again, you're going to turn it on or off with the switch on the lens. The camera's smart enough to know, A, it's an RF lens, and B, whether or not it has its own optical stabilization. When you do turn an RF lens with IS on, the stabilization on, you're going to get the most powerful combination of stabilization, combining what the optical IS would do and the stabilization in the camera can do, of certainly anything we've ever done. And we think this is going to be class leading stabilization in the industry. Again, that's with an RF lens that has its own IS, combining it with the built-in IBIS system in these two cameras. It is some potent stuff.
Wow. Rudy, I'm going to take it back to the 90s. You ate your Wheaties this morning.
I remember
you came,
that.
There you go. You came ready. You came ready for IBIS. That was a wonderful breakdown of the IBIS system, and in conjunction with the lenses. Now, I'm going to stay with you, Rudy. We love to talk about features and upgrades, but a very, very real aspect is when you're adding all this technology and when you're creating such a high-performing machine, a lot of people are going to ask about overheating. Is that an issue? Now, we did address it yesterday. Now, Drew and Doug from our B&H video team were out in 86-degree, brutal humidity all day shooting video and stills, and they didn't have any issues with the overheating. Can you talk about, you know, anything from a technical aspect, how that's been addressed as far as, I mean, it's a very real question when you're talking about putting all of these performance features into a camera. It has to, you know, it's going to pop into an engineer's head and say, hey, wait, we got to make sure we have the system that can handle this kind of processing.
Well, you hit it on the head right there with the last part of your comments, and that is the level of processing power in these two cameras. I started off saying this at the beginning of our discussion. The level of processing power in these two cameras is unprecedented in a Canon camera. It's incredible how much processing is going on with so many operations, imaging, speed, autofocus, and so on simultaneously. This is, you know, really a landmark level of processing inside an interchangeable lens camera. Now, unfortunately, given current technology, processing power means heat. And we can see that in a laptop computer, we can see it in mobile devices, and we sure as heck can see it inside of cameras like these. Obviously, the engineers did what they can to, you know, isolate components, to, you know, leave some degree of space for, you know, a little bit of air to, you know, kind of move heat to move away and that kind of thing. But we're not talking cameras that have vents. Obviously, you know, we're talking cameras that are actually quite well sealed against dirt and moisture and so on, and in a compact form factor. So they're not vented. They don't have an internal cooling fan. And yeah, when you start putting pedal to the metal, and that is underscored with 8K video or with 4K at 60p or 120p, you are going to build up a fair amount of internal heat. And there is a finite limit as to how long the engineers are saying that they are comfortable saying that customers can go. And we're trying to be as transparent about this as we can. Officially, they're saying that for 8K recording, if you start with the camera at room temperature, which they define as 23 degrees centigrade or 73 degrees Fahrenheit, if you start with the camera at room temperature, you can record for 20 minutes in 8K before the system will step in and say, okay, we are probably at that threshold where there's too much heat being sensed, and we're going to shut the camera down. You'll get a warning first, but you know, the camera will shut down after that if you don't give it a break. For 4K 60p, you got, like, I think 25 minutes before the system similarly will step in and shut down. That's 25 continuous straight minutes of recording. And then on the video side, this is not a heat-related limitation, but for the same reasons that we've had in SLR and digital SLRs and in mirrorless up to now, even if you're talking full HD at 24p, which is not stressing the processor out anywhere near as much as the high res settings are, your file size limit is 29 minutes, 59 seconds, and at that point it'll stop. Now, in that case, you can resume recording by just pressing the record button again. So if you happen to be right at the camera, you can press it and, you know, you lose a second or two, but that's it if you were, you know, on the lookout for it, reaching that 29, 59 threshold. But with the heat related stuff, it's a factor. And, you know, we know that. And these are not cinema EOS cameras. And, you know, we're trying to be, like I say, as transparent and upfront about this as we can be. And, you know, customers themselves are going to have to, you know, make a real world look and ask, is this something that is going to be, you know, an obstacle or an issue for me, or is it not? You know, I've already heard, you know, web reviewers on YouTube saying, oh, well, that's totally unacceptable. I can't use this. And they're doing YouTube broadcasts, which, you know, are being broadcast out in, you know, 120p and rather full HD. So, you know, I doubt very much that they're going to be doing a lot of recording of those in 8K long term. But, you know, again, every customer is different. The customers are going to have to determine that. But that's what we can tell you in terms of official numbers.
Okay. Now, Kevin, you told us yesterday, and I think it was pretty apparent, the autofocus is the one thing that you said, it blew you away and was something, the one feature that really, really stood out to you. Tremaine had asked a question, which one will be best for sports photography? Now, correct me if I'm wrong, but we're looking at the same autofocus, same frame rate as far as frames per second. Kevin, is there anything in your experience that could kind of lead towards one or the other, or do you think they're both equally cut out for someone who is into sports or wildlife photography?
I think for wildlife and sports photography, they're both equal. They're both fine for that. The thing is what are you gonna do with those pictures? If you're gonna do sports photography and you have a 45 megapixel image, your hard drive, you have to process all that stuff. Is it gonna be worth the time for you to transfer from the card to the computer, load those up in Photoshop, capture one, and take your time doing that? Or is 20 megapixels enough? Because the speeds, the autofocus, like you said, is the same on both. 12 mechanical, 20 electronic on both. So it just depends if you need the 45 megapixels or if you want 20. And I think most, you know, sports photographers are going to use the 20 megapixels because if you look at the sports camera that Canon has right now, the 1DX Mark III, that is 20 megapixels. And that's just a behemoth when it comes down to taking pictures of birds, wildlife, sports photography. It was basically made for the Olympics that, you know, didn't happen this year, but that's what it's for. So I think 20 megapixels on the R6 is definitely fine for, you know, birders. If someone wants something to blow up and make a poster of and they need that 45 megapixels, yes. And also with 45 megapixels, you can obviously recompose and crop in. So you've had that detail there and it looks the same, but that's basically your choice when it comes down to it. Is 20 megapixels enough? Because you're gonna need like the larger memory cards on the R5 because of the larger file size, 45 million pixels and such like
that. Rudy, we've had a lot of questions come in on the ISO performance, low light. And I think we're at the stage in photography. A lot more people are doing night photography, astrophotography, pretty much any situation. I mean, if you shoot indoors, it's low light. You're not getting good light unless you're outside. So a lot of people have asked about the ISO performance. Now, I know that the two cameras do have a different max ISO range. So if you could talk about the max ISO ranges of the two cameras, and also not only that, but are they rendering light the same way up until that max point, or are they handling light differently?
The reason I just made a face there was I was just processing in my mind the last thing you said. If what you meant by handling light was basically what's the ISO performance look like in terms of, you know, noise and so on. Again, advantage is going to go to the lower resolution camera, the R6 in this case, which really looks like it's going to be, of the two, the low light king. We expect its high ISO performance to be at least as good as the 1DX Mark III, if not even a tick better because it's slightly newer and a little more refined. The high ISO performance in the R5 at 45 million pixels is still exceptionally good based on what we've seen from pre-production cameras. I'm going to stop short of saying that for people that are doing night sky photography and other sort of specialized applications like that, you know, how does it compare to, you know, other cameras in the Canon line or certainly the competition or whatever. I'll leave it for smarter people than me to make those judgments, again, once production level cameras come out. But this much we can tell you, I can look you straight in the eye and say that the high ISO performance on both of these cameras, for the classic cameras they are, everything we've seen leads us to believe that they are going to be exceptional. the ISO range on the R5 camera with 45 million pixels is 100 to 51,200. And then it goes a step further to 102,400 as the standard ISO range on the R6 camera. Either one can be expanded by a stop in the plus direction with a custom function. So, you know, again, and the other thing too that, you know, makes this a little nebulous is that everybody's opinion about what constitutes an acceptable level of noise in a picture at high ISOs, everybody's opinions vary. And so, you know, what may be perfectly acceptable to one person, another person might say, well, geez, I'm more critical. That wouldn't work for me. So, you know, again, I'll use the word, you know, it's hard to quantify, you know, what is, you know, going to be acceptable to everybody. But I can say, based on what limited stuff I have seen from these cameras on pre-production cameras, I think customers have a lot to look forward to when they start raising those ISOs and working in low light conditions with both cameras.
Now, Kevin, you touched on earlier a couple of the points. Douglas B had a question about the video features. So we were talking about, he was asking about peaking, zebras, waveform, monitor LUT, 4K RAW, or if it's only in 8K. So you had talked about focus peaking, zebras. Did you delve into the features-wise as far as waveform, monitor LUT?
I didn't see waveforms or such like that. I did see the focus assist that Canon used from their cinema line. So you have the green arrows and they come together and they lock into place. That's in the R5. You do have, like you mentioned before, zebras and peaking and such like that. I can't speak to the RAW. I could go into the camera and see if it does for 4K, but it basically screams at you when you go into the menu. And what's nice about the menu when you choose your video is that it tells you basically all in one menu. It goes movie record size and you click on that and it says just across the way 8K. I'd probably see a little bit over here. So like it says 8K, then it gives you, so it's 8K DCI, 8K UHD, 4K DCI, 4K UHD, full HD, and then you go down to the second tier, which is your frame rates, and then it gives you all IR IPB. This is the R5. The R6 is IPB from what I could tell. It just only gives you a little bit of options, but when you click on 8K and you go through here, it gives you all I, and then you, actually the memory card should be in there. Go back. And yeah, obviously, Rudy pointed out, if you're gonna do like the 120, it's a separate menu item on there with the high frame rate mode. But over here, let me see if it's the RAW there. Oh, another thing too that I like about going to the menu system for other movies, it tells you right there how much recording time you're going to get. This is, you know, without overheating. This is just on the memory card itself. So as you go through everything, it tells you, oh, you could do five right now. It's 5 minutes and 19 seconds on for, what's that? That's 8K all I, and I can set that. Yeah, and that's how this one works. But for the most part, you do have a lot of nice options when it comes down to it. As far as probably Rudy could talk to see if there's any waveforms or such like that. I didn't see anything. I do see audio levels, which is great. A lot of people ask that because they want to monitor. A lot of vloggers want that. But I think Rudy could speak to the rest of it, hopefully.
Yeah, absolutely. There are no waveform monitors in either camera. That's something that you have to get into Cinema EOS to start to get those. One thing we haven't touched on the video that I should have mentioned right at the outset is that in the mirrorless or DSLR form factor with interchangeable lenses, these are the first full frame cameras, both the R5 and the R6, that are going to allow internal 10-bit 422 recording to the memory card. We do not require you to attach an external monitor and a recorder, excuse me, and go out via HDMI, although you have that option. But these cameras can record at full HD, 4K, or in the case of the R5 at 8K, 10-bit 422 internally to the camera's memory card. That, to some of our video users, is going to be a very important capability that right now, these two cameras are basically unique in offering.
Thank you for the expanding upon that, Rudy. I want to transfer over to wireless file transfer, and this is something that we haven't really touched upon yet. And it does for a lot of professional photographers. It plays a huge role. I mean, it's not something that when you look at the first couple features that play an important role in choosing a camera, it's not going to stand out, but it's every bit as important. You know, wedding photographers, people who are shooting once in a lifetime events where this is a huge part of their workflow. So Glenn was asking regarding wireless file transfer. Both offer Wi-Fi, with the R5 supporting both 2.45 gigahertz. What is the advantage of the optional file transfer module? Can I do a live file transfer while I'm shooting an event if the camera is connected to Wi-Fi? It's primarily focused on local file backup or transfer to a laptop.
Taking the last part first, the answer is yes. In terms of the optional WFT transmitter, it's called the WFT R10A in the case of the transmitter that's dedicated for the R5. Now, this won't work with the R6. Both have built-in Wi-Fi, but this external accessory transmitter is only for the R5 camera. But if you understand the basics of what Canon has done over the years in the EOS 1DX series with its optional accessory WFT transmitter, a far more powerful wireless transmitting device that instead of having a roughly 30-foot transmission limit from camera to computer or whatever the receiving device is, now you're talking under good wireless conditions, the ability to reach over 450 feet. That, for starters, is one of the things that the optional WFT accessory is going to offer you. It offers very robust networking capabilities. It is clearly targeted. It is bullseyed at news photographers, photojournalists, and so on, who are often working in situations where they have to get images out of Dodge as quickly as they can onto a wire service or a newspaper or a magazine or whatever's own network at an event. That could be a sporting event, it could be a major political event or the Oscars or whatever it might be. The WFT units in the 1DX have traditionally served that audience. And this unit is virtually the same in terms of its functionality. Now, that said, it is something that for some individual photographers who are not staffers at one of the wire services or something, it is something that some individual photographers are still going to find some benefits with. For instance, you can transmit to an FTP server, a host computer that's remote, and that if you have access to an internet connection, that can be on the other side of the world. It doesn't have to be just within the transmitter's transmission range. You've got the ability to do stuff like that, and that's with network security and so on. So we understand that's, above and beyond the needs of many working individual photographers, but it is there if you need it. Again, the transmission power is much, much greater. The transmitter, the WFT transmitter, has its own power supply. So you're not using the camera battery to perform Wi-Fi operations, so there's that much less draw on the camera battery for shooting purposes and so on. So that, in a nutshell, is what the accessory WFT is going to offer to photographers. Now, I realize we only scratched the surface of all its capabilities and that kind of thing. But again, anybody who's interested in doing a little research on this, if you go in and do an online search for the Canon WFT transmitters for the 1DX, this is going to be very, very much cut from the same bolt of cloth in terms of the functionality.
Yeah, look, Rudy, 2 hours. I don't know if it's enough time for. We're barely scratching the surface on a lot of things. So again, I just want to take a moment to thank everybody who's tuned in, everybody who's submitted questions. This really isn't possible without you, and it's great to see such interest in this new line of cameras. Now, Dan, I hope I'm not screwing up your name here. Dan Leberick had a couple questions. So Kevin, I want to bring you back in, and again, if you and Rudy can kind of go back and forth on this one. Dan had a couple questions regarding the face and eye detection, and I don't know how we're an hour and 15 minutes in and we didn't talk about animal tracking. And that's one of those things where it's like everybody, it's like whether you're pets or, again, we keep talking about wildlife photography. It's a big, big thing now. The ability to track animals is huge for autofocusing systems. Kevin, what kind of autofocusing were you using? Were you using the face and eye detect? And then Rudy, once Kevin wraps that up, I want you to go a little bit in. Dan was asking about the relationship between the face and eye tracking with the different focusing modes, with one shot, with servo, how it works into back button focusing. So if you're back button focusing, is that going to override, or is that going to work in cohesion with the face and eye tracking? So Kevin, what kind of focusing systems were you using? What kind of benefits did you see?
All right, so when I started, that was the first thing I did when I got the cameras, was like, let me see how the autofocus works. And so I put it on just standard one shot, and just taking pictures to see how the IAF worked. And over here, because of the store just reopened and we have plexi, so to keep everybody safe. And the camera was actually focusing through the plexi, locking onto the eyes, and then it would lock onto the head as you got further away, as you change your focal length and such like that. And it was sticking, which is great. Then I put it onto servo mode and had one of the associates over here just walk back and forth out in the store and see how well it stick there. And it locked on. It was seamless. It's like, you don't have to think, which is great, because you want to be able to frame your shot and get everything all right and just fire the shutter. Then I went outside and I said, you know what, let me try moving objects. Obviously, right now, there's no animals in by Hudson Yards, so it was people on bikes and just like locking onto them as they were going through, taxi cabs, getting some playing around with the IBIS built inside of it, slower shutters, dragging the shutter and such like that. It was great. It locked on. It's basically seamless. It's a nice step up. And I did see in the menu when I was playing around with it yesterday how it says, like, what do you want to prioritize? You like people, and then it's like you could go in there and pick animals and such like that. So it's really good for people who stuck at home and want to take pictures of like cats and dogs, and people are outside birding. It has an option, so you could do your portraits. A wedding photographer could just like fire all day and have it just lock on the face when you turn around. It still knows that that's where the head is. And also, if anybody watched the Canon release, one of the main things they mentioned, if it's like motocross, it locks onto helmets too, which is great.
Wow.
So I didn't see anybody with helmets. This is New York City, so helmet culture helmet culture isn't really there when you're on a city bike, but for the most part, it's people on bikes locked on. It was great.
And I think it's important, you talked about shooting through the plexiglass. That's one thing. I can't tell you how many shots through the years where I've tried to take through a window and it doesn't really lock in. And it's almost to the point where autofocus is getting so advanced now where it's like, it'll pick up shapes that kind of look like a face. And it's just so hyper sensitive. So to see that the camera is doing its job and fast moving objects. Now, Rudy, taking it back to the other parts of Dan's questions, with your face and eye tracking, how is that working in cohesion with the back button focus and with the different modes? So, one shot, servos.
Two separate things there. First off, let's address the back button autofocus. Think of that as just an alternative with any of our cameras, really. We could be talking about a 20-year-old EOS camera. Think of the back button autofocus as simply, instead of activating autofocus at the shutter button, you're activating it separately and independently from shooting with a back button that you press with your thumb. So back button autofocus does not change anything other than that you have the ability to start and stop by just taking your thumb off of it or pressing it in again to activate it. The beauty of the autofocus system in these two cameras, and this is maybe the most powerful example of the processing power in these two cameras, is how effectively these can identify subjects if you're using a larger focus area. That can be your zone AF, your large zone AF, or what we call face detect plus tracking, where virtually the whole picture area is active. And now the system, as Kevin described, is looking for faces and that kind of thing. If you do this in servo autofocus, where the autofocus is continuous and you maintain pressure at the shutter button with your finger, or alternatively the back button, either way, the system is live and it is continually updating its information. And that's where you're going to see the power of what Kevin was describing in terms of not just being able to follow a subject coming straight at the camera. That it'll do very well too. But the ability to track subjects moving around the frame, whether it's something like that B&H employee just walking side to side as he was sort of, following them in the viewfinder, to, cars whizzing by, to, skaters zigging and zagging through an array of cones or whatever it might be. Servo is where you're going to see the power of this feature. Now you can use it in the one-shot autofocus mode. Just to be clear, because I know there may be people coming to this event today who are not Canon shooters. When we say one-shot autofocus, that's Canon's way of saying single autofocus, where we lock focus on a subject and the system assumes the subject isn't going to move from that point. We've always called it one-shot. It has nothing to do with how many frames a second you can take. It's a little bit of a misnomer, but it is what it is. Anyway, one-shot autofocus, you can continue to use the eye detect, the face detect, and the head detect. Let me talk about that in a second, and so on. And the only thing is that when you initially grab onto your subject, you'll see green little boxes telling you, okay, this is where we focused. And as long as you maintain pressure on the shutter button or the back button, that's it. The system locks focus and it stays there. Even if the subject starts to move or whatever, it's locked at that particular point. Those points remain the active focusing points, and you'll see them right in the viewfinder or on the LCD monitor. So it'll work in either one-shot or servo. The most impressive results in terms of just examining the cameras are going to be if you put the camera in servo, no question. And I want to just expand briefly on the subject detection capability, because this is something, starting with the 1DX Mark III earlier this year, Canon really pushed forward mightily in this area. With humans, we have eye detection, face detection, and this one is important, head detection. Okay, and this is based on some deep learning technology and the DigicX processor, a totally new generation processor in the 1DX Mark III camera, and now in the R5 and the R6 cameras. The head detection is a vital part of this, because now the system can identify people at their heads and focus upon them if the faces are obscured, if somebody's wearing protective headgear for a sporting event or something, if a model has a hat with a large brim that's kind of coming down and covering the eyes or whatever, and the system can't make out eyes, two eyes, a nose, and a mouth. It'll, instead of just immediately defaulting to the chest area or trying to find something with detail in the background, it'll just put a box around the head. It recognizes heads in many, many different situations. That is a new element of detection that we didn't have before in the EOS R and RP series cameras, but we do now in the R5 and the R6. Now, on top of that, until the advent of these two cameras, we never had animal detection. And we know some of our competitors have come up with effective systems for animal eye detection and so on. We now have a very effective trifecta of animal detection that can detect eyes, faces, and bodies. So once again, think of when you can't see an entire face, when it's obscured, when it turns away, if you have an animal moving away, where the face is not really visible at all, the system is smart enough to be able to identify, okay, this is this type of animal, and we'll put focus on the body instead. So eye detection for animals, face detection for animals, and body detection for animals. And the system is especially tuned for cats, dogs, and birds. It may very well work with other types of animals as well, but those are the three that at this stage, the system has been, has the deep learning technology imbued into it to give us the power to do that. Now that ability, eye, face, and body detection, when it comes to animal detection, is something that, once again, right now, no other full-frame mirrorless camera can offer. We understand there's some competitors out there with powerful animal detection systems. But once again, I'll use that word. This is a trifecta that none of our competitors have at the moment.
Now, Rudy, you bring up the various facets of the face, eye, head, body detection. Is that something, it might be natural for somebody to ask, well, what if I want to turn that off? Is that something that I have to go into the menu? They might be in a situation where the technology works too good and they want a little more control over what they're getting their focus point on. Is that something that is only turned off through the menu, or are there quick keys that they can set, any function buttons to automatically turn that on and off?
There's a number of ways you can customize the camera, but to address your question, basically, first off, if you've got the camera set, if you've got what we call the AF method, which is just basically how big is your focusing area, if you've got it set for, in particular, face detect plus tracking, where pretty much the entire picture area is live. You can go into the AF menu under subject detection, and you can tell it, prioritize people, prioritize animals, excuse me, or no priority, in which case it is normally going to look for the nearest subjects with profound detail. It will still go to people if it detects a prominent person face in the scene, but normally it is much more resistant to just jumping on the face right away when you have it set for no subject priority. So you got that, a line item in the menu. Another thing too, I want, because there's some confusion about this, even before the advent of these cameras, and that is that, all the stuff about face detection, eye detection, that only takes place when you're dealing with a large focusing area, zone AF, large zone AF, or face detect plus tracking where the whole picture area is live. There are a lot of photographers who prefer to work in a traditional fashion like they have with their digital SLRs, where they're working with one focusing point, which they can freely move around, or if they're working with, an expanded focusing point, so they got one point with expansion points around it or whatever. In those cases, there is no face detection or animal detection or whatever. That's working very much like what we've been doing with our 5Ds and, in previous generations, our 1Ds and so on. You just put a point on a subject and, keep the subject at that point.
Interesting. Now, I do want to say I did get some information in from our team here. The initial shipping date is July 30th. However, as you said, and with many camera launches, the initial quantities available will be very limited, and B&H will keep our customers updated. So definitely, if you do not subscribe on our mailing list, definitely check that out as far as subscribing on our website, and we will do our best to keep our customers updated as everything goes along. Now, Kevin, I want to talk about the back screen. So we're talking about the LCD screen, touch screen. We had some questions on the touch screen. Did you get a chance to use it, play around with it? We had a question in particular from Facebook about focusing using the touch screen.
Oh, yeah. So it does have, so you can use just tap and go basically. I don't know if you can see it over here. Probably see my face, get my beard there. You can just tap, focus on there. Hold on. It's kind of weird, awkwardly doing that. So see the box getting bigger right there. That's just AF. And also, as like the prior cameras, you could select a part of the screen and use your thumb and actually if you want to focus, use like a mini joystick essentially. But it is very responsive. Like right now, it's looking onto that little extension over there, and it's quick and easy. And if you want touch shutter, you can do so as well. I'm a traditionalist, so like the standard shutter, but press it, takes a shot instantly, which is great. Yeah, and then you can change your shutter on the bottom, just rotating up like that. You can just go back and forth, as you see right there. I think for the cell phone generation, a lot of people like using the touch screens. Like traditionally, when I started getting into the whole cameras, that touch screens were few and far between. So I like the dials, just going through the dials very quickly. It's more tangible for me. But for those, who are coming up from cell phones or like point-and-shoot cameras with a touchscreen, you could adjust doing it that way. That's up to you, honestly. And both of them are going to operate the same way. It's just that the screen is just a little bit bigger on the R5. I think it's 3.2 versus 3 on the R6.
If I can, pardon the pun, if I can touch on something that Kevin just said, because he made a very salient point there. Obviously, the touchscreen interface that Canon has had for many years is one of, if not the best in the industry, and that's very much carried over into these cameras in terms of being able to make menu selections, and as you pointed out there just now, Kevin, camera setting selections, set your shutter speed, set your aperture, set your ISO and stuff. You can do it on the screen. One of the points of resistance on the layout and design of the EOS R camera when it was introduced, our first full-frame mirrorless camera, was the reliance on the touchscreen to make operations, changes, and so on to settings that photographers were used to doing with buttons and dials. And so photographers coming over from a 7D, a 5D, even a 1D series camera found this to be an acquired taste, let's say. One of the things I think it's so important on the R5 and the R6 to get across is that we have gone to a design now on these cameras with 3 traditional dials on the camera, on the back, on the right side. You've got the quick control dial on the back for instant access to exposure compensation in an automatic exposure mode, like aperture priority or whatever, or conversely, to adjust your lens apertures when you're in manual. You've got the main dial on top of the camera up by the shutter button to input your main settings like your aperture and aperture priority, your shutter and shutter priority, or your shutter speed when you're in manual. A beautiful addition is what we call quick control dial 2 on top of the camera. I have the camera right here. I hate doing this backwards. This is all backwards on what I'm seeing. But on the top of the camera right here, you've got a second dial that protrudes out the back. When the camera is awake, that gives you instant adjustment of your ISO. So with the without taking the camera from your eye, you can adjust ISO, you can adjust exposure compensation, you can adjust your primary settings, all with 3 traditional dials. And for those who, like, Kevin said, are from more of the smartphone generation who are more comfortable doing it with the touchscreen interface, you can do it there too. The point is that this isn't the same interface that we had with the EOS R and the RP camera. If you're coming to us from a digital SLR or another mirrorless camera, even a competitive system, you're going to find, I think, this to be a very intuitive way of working with the camera, and that it's very adaptable. And I haven't even gotten into the fact that you've got tons of customization ability as well. I was talking about everything at its default settings.
So Rudy, let's bring it back to lenses. We've had a number of questions about the 1.4 time and 2 time converters, particularly. Now, I'm going to fuse that with another question we got in. So Yasmin has said she joined late, so you made your question here. She was asking in particular about the 800 millimeter lens, the new 800 millimeter. Now, I'm looking at people asking questions about converters, and then we have an 800 millimeter lens. So converter, you're trying to get more reach. 800 millimeter lens at $899. Can you talk a little bit about the performance of the converters? Is this lens something that can say, hey, why go with a converter when you could just get an 800 millimeter?
Well, first off, the RF lens converters, very much in the mold of the EF 1.4 and 2 times extenders that we've had in the lineup for quite some time now, are going to be top-notch, professional-grade tele extenders. Anytime you're working with an extender, there's a couple of things you got to keep in mind. One is, you're not only, in layman's terms, I'm not talking like an engineer here because I'm not an optical engineer, but in layman's terms, anytime you magnify basically the power of a lens with a tele extender, in effect, you're also magnifying any of the aberrations that happen to be present in the lens. And even though one of the criteria for lens compatibility with extenders in the Canon system has historically been that the lens has to offer very, very good optical performance to begin with, the fact is, that even the big white lenses, the big super telephotos that are magnificent in terms of optical performance, any lens has some inherent residual aberrations. And if you go and take a 2 times extender, even if you disregard the effect of, haze from distance, and that air haze and heat haze and that kind of thing, even if you disregard all of that, you're going to see, some of those aberrations are going to become more apparent. So, I mean, that general truism is going to carry through here in terms of the 1.4 times extender and the 2 times extender versus a lens by itself. Now, right now, those extenders, which we just introduced along with the R5 and the R6 camera for the EOS R system, are compatible with the new RF 100 to 500 millimeter lens that we just introduced, the L series lens. And they are also compatible with the RF 600 millimeter f11 and 800 millimeter f11 STM lenses. So they can be used with those. Real quick, this wasn't directly part of your question, and I don't want to sideways off into another area. But
go for it.
Traditionally, those of us who've been around cameras for a while have been schooled that with digital SLRs for decades, we were told that they can't focus, autofocus, at a maximum effective aperture, you know, lens plus whatever we're losing in terms of light with the extender, of slower than f5.6. Now, in recent years, not just Canon, but other companies in the industry have expanded that so that we could do autofocus with cameras like a 5D Mark IV, for instance, at least some of the focusing points at an effective f8. So if we took an f4 lens, like a 300 millimeter f4 EF lens, and put a 2x extender on it, effectively that's now an f8 lens, we could still get autofocus at least to some degree. With the mirrorless cameras, that changes. With the EOS R and RP, our first generation cameras, we could get autofocus off the imaging sensor, dual pixel CMOS autofocus, at an effective f11 or wider. And now with the EOS R5 and R6 cameras, we can get autofocus at an effective f22 or wider. So again, we're not talking about the aperture you take a picture at. We're just talking about the effective maximum aperture of a lens plus extender when they're just simply mounted on the camera and the camera's trying to autofocus with the lens wide open. That's where that becomes germane. So again, I think a lot of people may have been a little confused, like, well, wait a minute, f11, can these even autofocus? Because I know on my digital SLR that wouldn't have been possible. And, you know, they'll take an extender, you know, at f22 with a 2x extender. How are we going to autofocus? The fact is you can't. Now, obviously, it's going to work. The autofocus is going to work better in, you know, outdoor lighting conditions and such, especially with a 2x extender on it. But it is compatible. The two extenders are compatible with the 600 and the 800 millimeter lenses.
Okay. Now, Kevin, what lenses were you using? Were you using EF lenses?
I was using, so I had a 24-105 RF lens. I had a 15-35 RF. I had used a 50 RF lens, and then with the control ring adapter, I used the 24-70, the 2.8, which doesn't have any stabilization. But I know people were asking, and I see it on the Q&As on like B&H's website, and just our employees asking me, is how's the stabilization on this? I was holding this for like a second on this, and this lens obviously has no stabilization in it. It's just the body on this one, and sharp. It's really good, and that's just with the adapter. And there are obviously 3 adapters for the RF system. So you have one that has a control ring. So any EF lens that obviously doesn't have a control ring, it gives you that functionality on the bottom. You can change your settings. Then you have one that's just a straight adapter. And then you have one that you could put filters in it. So those are the 3 different adapters. One's a filter, one gives you the control ring functionality, and the other one is just a straight EF to RF adapter. So those are the lenses I was using, and I do like, obviously you don't need to change, if someone's coming from an EF system to the RF system, you don't need to change your lenses right away. You could just wait and see what Canon comes out with. Your lenses will work with this because the adapter is made by Canon for Canon lenses, for a Canon camera, so you don't have to worry about weird translations that happens if you go third party. But you could take your time. If you start with, let's say, a 24-105, or you could just, you know, use the lenses you have, and then if you see something wonderful that Canon has already, you could just, you know, jump on it. Another thing too is just like, you just like, honestly, you know, kind of Amtrak right there, because I'm thinking of so much of these lenses, but you don't have to just rush and just get the lenses just because it's out. Oh, that's what I was going to say. When you start with the RF system, you'll realize that, I mentioned this before, just where the rear element is, puts the weight towards the back, and it makes it so much more comfortable to hold. Like the 70-200 from on the RF series feels so light compared to the one on the EF. I did have questions for Rudy, though, that are more pertain to the teleconverter, because a lot of people, like when I got up like yesterday at 8 o'clock in the morning just to see the Canon presentation and actually get all the information to give to my employees. One of the questions that populated on our website is, with the teleconverters, people were asking, all right, I see the Canon website, it says that it's not, just so I want to put it out there. The 70-200 2.8 does not work with the teleconverters. That is correct, right?
Yes.
Okay. And I realized people are like, why isn't it like that? I believe, I'm not an engineer, but the rear the element of the teleconverter protrudes, and then the back element is so close in there, so it probably doesn't work.
Yes. Priority clearly on that 70-200 millimeter f2.8 RF lens was in terms of a drastic reduction in size and weight, something unprecedented compared to any other 70 to 200 f2.8 lenses in the industry right now for full frame cameras. And they achieved that. One of the consequences of doing that was the rear section of the lens at many focal lengths has to be virtually flush with the lens mount. And if you look at any of the Canon extenders, even the older EF units, just as a reference point, but certainly the new RF extenders, the front section of the extender protrudes out and goes into the rear of the lens that it attaches to. The idea of doing that is so that on a lens that is designed for extender operation, we can get even more evenness of illumination and sharpness performance centered a corner with those lenses that are designed to accept the extender than we could if we had the front of the extender just flush with the front of the extender's mount. So it would be way cool if we could take the RF extenders and use them on the 70 to 200 RF f2.8 lens, in part because of its remarkable size. But we can't. The engineers made a deliberate decision here to forego extender compatibility in the interest of coming out with a lens that otherwise is revolutionary in terms of the size, the weight. It's nearly a pound lighter than its predecessor and competitive 70 to 200 millimeter 2.8 lenses in the system now, on the market, I should say. So, we understand there are going to be some people disappointed with that. But once again, I'll use the word, we want to be as transparent and upfront about that as possible. It's not an accident. It's not just sloppy engineering or whatever. It was a deliberate design choice. And, we'd love to have seen it too. That I can say.
Another question about the teleconverters is that I was reading there's a press release on the teleextenders and the 100 to 500, and something pointed out is that the teleconverter, I think the 1.4 only works within a certain point of the range of that lens. It's like 300 to 500, I believe. It doesn't work at the wider angles. Is that true?
Yeah, once again, it's the basic concept is kind of similar if you look at the new 100 to 500 lens and to some degree that 70 to 200 f2.8 RF lens, which is so much more compact. Now, the 1 to 500 that we just announced yesterday, it's not as revolutionary in terms of compact size, but one of the things, again, is that at its wider zoom settings, lower than 300 millimeters, the back section of the lens starts to come real close to be flush with the lens mount. And again, that's not going to work with an extender. So with either of the RF extenders on the new RF 100 to 500 millimeter L series lens, the lens itself has to be zoomed to 300 millimeters or higher, 400, 500, whatever, to be able to physically attach the extender on and to use it. Now, it's not like you're going to have a glass against glass collision if you don't. There is actually a sort of like a protective stopper ring inside the 100 to 500 lens that moves. It's actually a little closer to the mount than the rear section of the lens. And it's combined with it. So as you zoom, you'll see this little stopper ring, this protective stopper ring move with the rear section of the lens, it being a little closer to the lens mount. So that will actually come in contact with an extender if you tried to put the extender on at a wider setting, and it'll just keep you from doing it without harming the glass on either your extender or on the back of the lens.
Thank you for that. That's really good because a lot of people were asking for it. And as you said, it's basically, you want a small lens or do you want to zoom in very, very, very far? So thanks for that.
That's really, just really quick. As popular as that 100 to 400 EF lens has been with wildlife photographers and street shooters and so many other type of photographers, this new 100 to 500 millimeter lens, even though we gained another 100 millimeters at the telephoto setting, it's nearly half a pound lighter than the 100 to 400 EF lens. And that's a noticeable difference. So that's something to just file away for those that are just looking at this lens and asking, well, what's it about? What's different on it?
Thank you.
Now, Kevin, Rudy, we've been getting a lot of great response, a lot of questions. I'm thinking of going another half an hour. You guys, you got gas in the tank?
I sure do. It's a pleasure to be with the B&H community.
Wonderful. I can hear the Rudy chants in the background now. It's like watching the old movie.
All I can say is thanks, Mom.
Now, bring it back to Gideon's question here, and I do want to go back. I want to touch on Gideon's question. It's an interesting question here, but I do want to go back to the whole EFRF thing as far as it relates to the autofocusing system. But Gideon asked, in particular, in regards to artificial lighting. So for people who shoot in situations where they do need to use the electronic shutter, and they're worried about banding. So you're combining artificial lighting with an electronic shutter. Obviously, people are going to talk about sensor read speed, banding. How are these cameras rendering that?
They are, once again, they are distinctly better than what we had with the EOS R system. And that starts with the hardware speed, the sensor speed itself, the speed that it can scan the sensor surface area with as each image is recorded. You know, again, I'll repeat, it's not a global shutter. We're not saying that there's no possibility of issues with, you know, erratic lines and that kind of thing, artifacts like that, or from, you know, strong movement, especially at the fast shutter speeds with the electronic shutter. You know, you can run into distortion and so on, but it is much better controlled from what we've seen on pre-production cameras than what we had with the previous EOS R camera. I think, you know, with virtually any mirrorless camera, Canon or any other brand, with virtually any camera out there, any photographer who's working indoors under artificial light using the silent shutter, they're going to be well advised to take a couple of test shots, even just pointing the camera down at the floor or at a blank part of a wall or something, to just see if there is any evidence of banding or whatever at the shutter speeds they're thinking about working at in this particular situation. Now, I don't care if you're a wedding photographer and you want to be discreet during the church service. I don't care if you're, you know, photographing a news conference and they're asking photographers to, you know, tone down the click, 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 click noise. So you go electronic shutter. You gotta test it in every situation first, just as a prudent insurance that I'm not going to potentially run into a problem here. But that said, I repeat, it doesn't even matter. We expect. I have seen this myself on pre-production cameras. The performance at higher shutter speeds under flickering LED type lights is much better than what we had with the EOS R. And I'm not trying to knock the EOS R, but it's a yardstick that has been out there now for a couple of years, and that people can, it's a point of reference that many in the photographic community, Canon shooters and non-Canon alike, know. And these are clearly a step forward.
Now, Rudy, I told you I wasn't lying. Will says, Rudy is awesome, has been so helpful. So there you go. The proof is in the pudding. It's right there. And Will, he also echoes the sentiments of a lot of people. So I said we wanted to get back to the EF lenses in particular. You know, again, people have been buying these lenses for years and had success with them. And a huge, you know, people get vested in their gear. And it's a huge investment. So people naturally will wonder about transferring the old gear to the new gear. And a question that has come up time and time again through our website and the questions that we're getting from Facebook in regards to the IBIS and the autofocus system, in particular with the EF lenses, are people getting the same performance? Now, I know we've addressed it, and it's something that, you know, for people who didn't tune in sooner, or it's a lot of information to digest. If you could just rehash, in particular, not to the RF lenses, but to the EF line of lenses, in regards to IBIS and autofocus, are you getting the full advantage of these systems on the new bodies with the EF lenses?
Yeah, all the stuff we talked about in terms of autofocus, the subject detection, the animal detection capability. You know, when Kevin was referencing the system's ability to just grab onto eyes and hold on to them, and in servo to just, you know, as a subject move, to keep following smoothly along with the subject, all that goodness works with an EF lens on the camera as well. As long as the lens has autofocus. So, you know, again, a tilt shift lens isn't going to do it. But as long as the lens has autofocus, you are going to get the same focusing power that you get with an RF lens. Now, as far as image stabilization is concerned with the new IBIS system, again, it'll kick in even if your lens doesn't have any optical stabilization built in. Talking about EF lenses now. And to repeat, if your lens does have its own in the lens stabilization, optical stabilization in the lens, the IBIS system will work simultaneously with it. Whatever shake correction you would normally expect with the lens by itself on your digital SLRs or whatever, you're going to get that plus an added measure of shake correction because of the IBIS system and its 5-axis correction capability working in tandem with it. That is not going to be to the same level of shake correction that we would get with an equivalent RF lens because the communication is so much more extensive between RF lens and EOS R camera body. But it isn't just will the stabilization work if I take my EF lens or my EFS lens for that matter and put it on an EOS R camera. It's not just a matter of is it going to work. It's going to work and work better than what you've been able to do up to now with an EOS R camera with no IBIS, or certainly with your digital SLRs and so on, which of course had no IBIS system either, in body stabilization.
Now, Kevin, we had a question coming in. I'm not sure it's something that we can really answer, but I do want to bring it up because it brings up an interesting point. And it's, are mirrorless cameras the future of photography? And this is something that 5-6 years ago, a lot of people would have been like, they would have scoffed at it. You know, it was DSLR is the way, and, you know, full frame DSLR. But now, you know, we've talked about it time and time again about the R5 and the R6 and how they not only stack up to the 1DX3, but as Eric and Drew talked about yesterday, in some regards, it's superior in some of the specs. So Kevin, if you could just give a little insight on your own about where you see mirrorless, you know, how this new release and, you know, what it means to people who have held on to DSLR and full frame DSLR for so long and have not wanted to jump into mirrorless just yet.
I think when it comes down to I remember when mirrorless cameras first came out, maybe around 2010, 2009, everybody, like I mentioned before, everybody's like, oh, these are toys. So as I think now, it's more legitimate. We have, every brand now has mirrorless cameras. Like Canon has their setup. They have two setups. They have the M line too. You have the other big brands that are out there, and they make for pros. They make people who are more video centric. They make for just photographers, and I think it's just it's an evolution. Like TLRs existed, so people were going on with their Rolleiflexes, and then rangefinders came out, and then SLRs came out, and then digital came, and the camera industry is going to evolve. It's evolution, it's technology. But I think now at 2020, when every brand had the time to look at the lay of the land, it's like, oh, people are going to buy mirrorless cameras. People want something smaller. People want new lenses. Like Canon is a good example of a manufacturer who's like, you know what, redoing the mount gives us a chance to do something that we haven't done with lenses before. Like the 600 and 800 f11s. Those are, I've never seen anything like that. I mean, something close to that would be like the mirror lenses that like you would come out and people were just like, oh, I have donut looking bokeh. But it's an evolution, and things are going to be, as long as the technology keeps up, and it is, these brands are competing with each other and they're just pushing each other. So for the photographer, we're going to have so many options, and it's to be so much new boundaries we could push, because now like Canon has the deep learning inside of their other camera brands, like Canon's doing it with AI, and can just machine learning. It's going to be in these cameras, and smartphones have it too. So everything is getting more computer based and just smarter. And mirrorless is just going to be the extension and evolution of the photography industry overall.
Rudy, I see you over there. I'm reading your facial expressions, and you've been in the game a couple of years, right?
A couple, 3.
What has this been like to really see a mirrorless camera that, again, as Kevin said, it's always been like, well, this is the toy camera, this is the professional tool. And now you guys are really bringing them into the same class with this release.
Yeah, really. And again, there's no way to say this without it sounding like I'm sort of giving a backhanded slap to the previous full frame efforts, the EOS RP and the EOS R camera, and I'm not intending to do that. Those have been and will continue to be very important products in our line, and they brought a lot of customers into full frame mirrorless, which to us is an important area for growth. There's no question that these two new cameras, the R6 and the R5, just totally changed the industry dynamic in terms of full frame mirrorless and its perception. I mean, we've had strong competitive products in the industry in full frame and in APS-C for that matter, in mirrorless, you know, up to now. And, you know, these really strike an important blow in, you know, tipping the scales maybe a little more in the direction that, you know, mirrorless cameras can now, to some photographers, take the place of what digital SLRs traditionally have done. And I don't mean just photo enthusiasts. I mean, you know, working photographers, whether they do commercial work, news work, photojournalism and stuff, weddings and events, whatever. Now, all that said, there's no question that if you look at the sales numbers, and I don't work in Canon's sales department, but if you look at the sales numbers right now, there are more digital SLRs with interchangeable lenses that are sold on a monthly basis in the US market than there are mirrorless cameras. I'm certainly not saying mirrorless isn't catching up. And like I say, the EOS R6 and R5 have struck a very powerful blow in that direction to really garner attention to the mirrorless category for anybody who's remotely interested in cameras and photography. But, you know, I come from a digital SLR background. I've always been comfortable working with digital SLRs. I love what these new cameras represent. I love the features. I love the handling. I love the performance. I love the possibilities. But, you know, to anybody that, you know, sort of looks fondly on the digital SLR, I'll say without hesitation, hey, that old dog can still hunt.
I want to bring it back over to video. And we had a lot of people asking about compression, all-eye and IPB. What kind of compression are we looking at in the video?
Did you want me to take that?
Yeah, you could jump on that, Rudy.
I'd be happy to. In the case of the R5 camera, the 45 million pixel version, you can shoot a choice of all-eye or IPB in full HD, 4K, or 8K. And you have the additional choice in 8K of 8K raw recording if you are so inclined. In the case of the R6 camera, you are limited to IPB compression only. The only all-eye is for time-lapse video and one other, but it's not like it isn't like in general for video recording you have a choice. It will be the more highly compressed IPB type compression. Now, I don't want to masquerade as a video specialist. There are certainly people who are more expert in video than I am, but I'm led to believe by people who know better than me that the IPB, the added compression on IPB is mostly a factor in situations where you have like fast moving subject matter from frame to frame to frame. And also in terms of the amount of computer processing power that is needed for basically transcoding and especially for like really fine, precise edits. So it's not like just, I think we're still photographers, I think have a picture in their mind and, oh, if something's more highly compressed, it's like a bad JPEG that just, oh, it's gonna have tons of artifacts and it's gonna look like crap, pardon my language, and so on. And in a lot of cases, that's not the case. And the R6 actually, I think for many video users, I'm not talking about for the Hollywood cinema community and such, but I think for many video practitioners, the R6 actually has some very powerful video capabilities. And you throw on top of that the extremely robust autofocusing performance, the high ISO noise performance, which translates into video as well as stills and so on. The R6 actually is a very appealing camera for somebody who is video centric or at least who wants to have video capability in addition to their stills capability.
Now, for those that heard the sirens, I told you, Rudy's on fire over there. He's on a roll. That's why, if you're just joining us, we are extending another half an hour. So we're going to take this out to 1:30 p.m. Eastern time. A lot of questions, a lot of information. Again, some of you are joining us later, so we're trying to rehash things as they come in and really just get to as much information as we can. I want to bring it back to a question from Joey Morelli on Facebook. He had a 7D that introduced a lot of moire and rolling shutter artifacts. How are these effects in the R5?
Should be, vastly improved. I mean, 7D and 7D Mark II for years have been two of my favorite Canon cameras in terms of just the design and all that good stuff. They just work so beautifully in your hands. But let's face it, 7D Mark II was the most recent of the two, was introduced in 2014. That was 6 years ago. So you're talking an imaging system, sensor, processor, everything else in the food chain, so to speak, that's 6 years beyond. And, you know, any experience you have, I think, for still or video image quality referencing a 7D Mark II, you're talking like multiple generations we've advanced, particularly now looking at the R6 and the R5 cameras. So, you know, people who use the 7D Mark II and love it, keep right on using it, rock and roll. But just understand, if you're, you know, looking critically at its imaging quality using, you know, a magnifying glass in the year 2020, with what we know about imaging in the industry now, I think you're going to find these cameras to be a huge step forward.
Yeah, camera years are like dog years. I mean, 6 years in terms of camera upgrades that's about two decades worth. So, Kevin, Andrea had a question regarding, she's an architectural photographer, only shoots with TSE lenses. So for those of you who don't know, TSE is a tilt shift lens on a 5D RS. Wanted to know, is there any reason why Andrea should switch to a mirrorless system? Or if you could give, based on your experience, for someone who's using primarily tilt shift or shooting architectural photography, what might be some of the benefits that you could see with the R5 and R6 to switching?
It comes down to it. One thing that I would say right away from people who are more comfortable with DSLRs like the 5D, 5DSRs, 1DXs, one thing is I've noticed in all my years doing this is that one is people getting used to the EVFs. A lot of people, like the people who are very, hold on, there's a car going, we're in a B&H Superstore, so it's a little bit, you know, active. But for the most part, the EVFs, these are really great EVFs. When EVS first started coming into the industry, a lot of people were like, oh, it looks like you're looking at a small TV in a little box. They're so much better. Both are OLEDs. The R5 is a little bit, has more dots versus the R6, but they're nice refresh rates. It's almost like you're looking through a real viewfinder, in my opinion. I'm used to the EVFs, and I know there's a lot of people who have been shooting for years that love the DSLR. What you see is what you get as far as it works for them. So that's one thing, the EVFs. The second thing that I realized a lot of people are kind of hesitant going to DSLRs is basically, from mirrorless to DSLRs, vice versa, I mean, is the battery life. Since you don't have the EVF, the battery life is going to last longer on a DSLR. So you'll be able to shoot 800 shots per charge, as opposed to something like this. You know, it's rated, but in real world, you could get a lot out of it, 500 shots. You can shoot all day on probably one battery on this. But that's one thing I've noticed from people who are reluctant to move from a DSLR to a mirrorless camera is either the EVF or the battery life. Honestly, as far as if they have a TSE lens and they're comfortable and the specs line up for their camera, they could stay in with a DSLR. That's fine, honestly. It's your choice. You have two. Actually, you have a lot of great options and from Canon that you could stick to. But if you need something smaller, if you're getting sick of the lenses being huge or you want better balance, a lot of people move to mirrorless cameras because as their age, they can't hold something big for a long period of time. That's one reason why you would want to go to a mirrorless camera that I realize. For me, why I went mirrorless, I started with the 70D, and I went mirrorless because I was commuting to the city and I wanted something smaller. And from there, like, the whole mirrorless lineup from any brand is just better for me. I travel, and you don't want to go, and if some architectural photography, if you're going overseas and such like that, you could pack more in a bag, especially with lenses and such like that, with a mirrorless camera as opposed to like a 1DX or a 5DSR. You have more room, especially with a grip too. So it all adds to the volume of a bag, and you have to check it now. And, you know, you don't want to fight for overhead bins when travel becomes back to normal. But essentially what it comes down to is mirrorless gives me the performance and the size to do what I want without, you know, compromising on image quality. That's one of the things. People think that you go to mirrorless and you compromise on image quality. That's not the case. A lot of these manufacturers use the same sensors, if not better sensors, than their DSLR line. So it's honestly size and convenience for when it comes down to it.
And Kevin, in sticking with the settings, we had a question come in from Facebook as well about the maximum shutter speed or maximum shutter time having it open? Is there still bulb mode time feature on there?
Yeah, there is. There's you just have to this is, I should probably say this fold backwards, so it's weird. You have a bulb mode right there on this is the R6, which has a traditional mode dial. On the R5, which has a newer type that was first introduced in the R, turn on here, you press that and you just rotate through it, and you can also use a touch screen and it's bulb right there. So that's there. You do have your time lapse intervalometer inside of there. You do have that's built in, and some people ask if it has multiple exposures. Yes, it has multiple exposure mode if you want to get really creative. So Canon didn't remove anything that you're used to on other lines. They wouldn't. They listen to the customer base, which is great.
And Kevin, what kind of input-output are we looking at? Joey asked particularly if the HDMI port outputs 10-bit to an Atomos ProRes recorder without menu overlays. So if you want to give us a little bit of a look at the cameras as far as input-output, tell us what we're looking at and that. And Rudy, if you want to, when he's done, kind of go, piggyback off that and go more in depth.
So I'll show you the camera input-output ports. And so basically, this is the R6. So you have a micro HDMI. You have USB Type-C. You do have a mic and headphones, so it could monitor your audio. You have your traditional. Well, this is more of the 2.5 sub-mini for your shutter release on this one. I do know that these cameras do have clean HDMI, so if anyone wants to go to an external recorder, they can do so without the overlays. Since it's clean, Canon's not going to, shoot them in the foot with that. When it comes down to the R5, the same layout, USB-C, HDMI micro, and you do have the mic and headphone jacks right there, and you do have the PC sync port right there. So if you're going to go to a flash system and so on and so forth, and then in the front, you have the bigger 3-pin remote shutter release that you find on the higher end cameras that Canon has, but this is a higher end camera, so obviously.
Rudy, anything to add on that?
Yeah, a couple things, and everything Kevin said was right on. One point I want to make clear, I just want to first off underscore something that he said. The HDMI port on these cameras is a micro HDMI, which is smaller than the HDMI port we have had on the EOS R series and the 5D series and so on. So many Canon customers are going to need, at the very least, to get an adapter micro to mini. We had been using the mini HDMI as the direct connector into the camera previously, or just simply update their HDMI cords altogether. So just be aware of that. That cord you've been using with your 5D Mark IV or whatever isn't going to fit into this camera for HDMI. And he's absolutely correct, Kevin, is that you can do clean HDMI out. Just understand that regardless of the capabilities of a recorder that you may attach, this system cannot transmit 8K through the HDMI. The maximum that it can transmit is 4K. So even if you record in 8K on the camera menu, it's going to, and if you connect to a recorder, it's going to send it out in 4K. So it's a limitation of the HDMI system. If you want to record actual 8K footage, it's going to have to be to the CF Express card in the EOS R5 camera. So just be aware of that.
And I wanted to ask about the buffer speed. We had a question in particular, how many raw shots you can take before the camera kind of catches up and you start to see a lag in the images being captured. So what kind of buffer speed are we looking at? Or if you want to give me a little bit more of the specs on the processing.
No, I can give you the numbers. The official numbers from Canon are for the R5 camera, 45 million pixel camera, you can shoot up to 180 raw images in a continuous burst. That's your burst rate. Before the camera has to call time and start, clearing the buffer and slow way down. If you're shooting full res, best quality JPEGs, that's about 350 JPEG images. Again, this is at full resolution, 45 million pixels. So 180, 350 shots, raw and JPEG. On the R6 camera, 20 million pixels, obviously the files aren't as big, so we can move them faster and we can move more of them. So we go up to 240 raw images in a burst if we're recording to a UHS-2 SD card. and over 1,000 full res best quality JPEGs in a continuous burst. Again, to a UHS-2 SD card.
Now, Kevin, I'm going to set you up here. I just want to have you get into the menu. I'm going to kick it back to Rudy with another question, but if you could, so when we come back to you, I wanted to look at the various video modes. We touched upon it yesterday, and as a lot of the cameras that are out today, you have your options as far as what kind of video modes you're shooting in. So if you could just cue that up and have that ready, I'm going to come back to you in a second. But we did have another question come in from Matt Rudy. Going back to FTP transfer, is this only possible with the grip? And to kind of relay off of that, are the older grips working on the newer bodies?
I'm glad you asked the first part of that question, and I'll address the second part as well. First off, FTP wireless transfer can now be done with the internal built-in Wi-Fi in both the R6 and the R5 cameras to a host computer that is A, within wireless range, and B, that has the appropriate Mac or Windows software to create FTP server capability in the computer. So the answer is we didn't have that before. So, before the advent of the R6 and the R5, the answer to that question was, yes, you need to get the optional WFT transmitter to be able to do FTP file transfers. It's not required anymore, although obviously the WFT does bring some other benefits like we talked about. And I'm sorry, there's a second part of that question. I'm having a senior moment. I can't remember. What was that?
No, I was asking about the older grip. So is the older grip still compatible on the newer body?
No, it isn't. There is a new battery grip called the BG-R10 that'll work with both the R6 and the R5. So it's cross-compatible between the two. But any of the older version battery grips and so on are not going to be directly compatible with these two new cameras.
Okay. And Kevin, back to you discussing that video. Can you tell us a bit about the video modes?
As far as
recording, what are we looking at? 4K, HD, frame rate?
So it shouldn't blank away, hopefully. So you see the top over there, you have 8K DCI, 8K UHD, and you have your 4K DCI, 4K UHD, which is a different aspect ratio, 17:9 by 16:9. You have full HD right there. It's not in focus, but I hope you, actually looks not that bad. And you see next row, you have your frame rates. So you have things gray out when you're, depending on your setting, but you have 29.97 frames, 24 frames, 23.98 frames, and you have your different compression. So all IPB. And it looks like you have, I think this IPB light, depending on your setting that you put on there. But then at the top, it tells you your record time. So as you go through your settings, like right now, it's 4K DCI. I went up to an hour on this memory card. The R6 is a little bit different because it doesn't do 8K, but that's not for everybody, honestly. You just have let me move it over here. Now it's a little bit different. You have your 4K, 4K 60, 4K 30, 4K 24, then you have your full HD. And one thing to note, Rudy mentioned this before, if you're looking for the higher frame rates, it's a different menu item. So you have to go underneath there. It says enable, disable. You enable it, and it allows you to do your high-speed 120 full HD on this camera, and then the high-speed 4K on this one. It's a separate menu item. So if someone buys a camera and is like, oh, where's my 4K 120? It's a different sub-menu to turn that on.
Now, Rudy, to bring in, you want to stay there?
I was just going to say if I can quickly add something to that. And once again, Kevin was spot on everything he said. One thing we didn't mention is that anytime you're recording 4K, the maximum recording resolution for video on the R6 camera, once again, the 20 million pixel camera, that's being oversampled from a 5.1K original down to 4K, which should enhance detail and quality and so on. And once again, that's from virtually the full width of the imaging sensor. In the case of the R5 camera, if you are recording 4K video and you go to a separate line item in the menu that says, once you've told it, hey, I want to do 4K, I want to do it at 24p or 30p or 60p, whatever it might be, there's a separate line item in the menu called 4K HQ mode. You got to go in there and enable that. But if you do, you are now going to get 4K that is oversampled from an 8K original. So once again, that it gives us the promise of even more detail and so on in our finished video file than we might have gotten otherwise. I repeat though, on the R5 camera, you got to enable that. If you just simply tell it, hey, I want to do 4K at 30p or whatever, it's not going to give you that without that being enabled as a separate line item.
And could we stick on video for a minute? We had a question come in earlier from Facebook with the R5. Can the R5 get the DGO announced for the C300 Mark III as a firmware update? Said the same processor and 8K output of the R5 should theoretically allow it. Is that true?
This is one where I'm going to have to kind of punt. I honestly don't know. There are certainly going to be some aspects of Cinema EOS, which to some degree carry over into these two cameras. And then there are going to be other aspects that are Cinema EOS goes its own way. And I am honestly not sure if this is one of them or not.
Okay. See, we're getting into a game of Stump Rudy. They said this guy is so on point. I want to bring it back to the autofocus. We talked about it earlier. It's super impressive. And autofocus is one of those things where, I mean, let's face it, it's one of the most important aspects of a camera nowadays. With everything requires accurate focus, the speed of light, it's fast. 1,035 focus points, am I correct?
When you have the camera set for face detect plus tracking, once again, all the entire screen area is active. You've got it when the camera is picking the focus points for you, like in face detect plus tracking. You've got 1,053 distinct zones. Now that is way up. In other words, much finer segmentation, much smaller individual zones than what we had on the previous generation, where the max we had was 143 zones for face detect plus tracking. So this is really a much finer system. Now, another question people ask is, well, they'll say, okay, that's fine if I'm letting the camera pick the point for me, but I'm old school. I like to just pick my own focusing point, but you know, can I move it? Two things here I want to get across. One is, number one, if you manually pick a single focusing point, you can move it, on the case of the R5 camera, you can move it to over 5,900 distinct locations, up, down, left, right, etc. So you've got extremely fine placement capability. In the case of the R6 camera, even though it's lower resolution, it actually is 6,072 potential locations for a single focusing point to be manually moved by the photographer. So you got very, very, very fine and precise control over where you put a focusing point. But here's the other thing. We mentioned already that both of these cameras have a proper 8-way multi-controller on the back of the camera. One of the things that is so impressive, and this won't really hit home until your customers actually come to B&H and put these cameras in their hands. And I realize they can't do that quite yet, but it's coming. When you engage that multi-controller, the responsiveness of that controller in terms of manually moving the focusing points is dramatic. It is so responsive when you just, start to move it. And unlike on the digital SLRs, where each notch you moved it required a separate button press on the multi-controller on a camera like a 5D, for instance, or something, here, if you just push it, it'll just steadily move. And it moves with much more speed and alacrity and responsiveness, I'll use that word again, than what we have on the EOS RP or EOS R cameras, which once again, I know is the barometer that a lot of people somewhat familiar with Canon are thinking about. This is just a whole nother level.
Now, Kevin, as you see, everybody, the Superstore is back and open, the B&H Superstore, practicing all social distancing and safety protocols. But once we can get our hands on this, and you yourselves can get your hands on this, I do recommend, like Rudy said, go in to the B&H Superstore, feel the camera in your hands. I mean, really, Kevin talked about it earlier, the ergonomics and the weight distribution, and how it's a mirrorless camera that's beefed up to what we thought only DSLRs were capable of before, but we're now putting it in a lighter, more compact body, right? Kevin, if we can go back to video, we had Andre on Facebook asking a question about 1080p at 120 frames per second and 240, or even 720p options, asking where those are.
And so I saw that question too, and I dived into the R5. So on there, it honestly looks like when you go into the movie recording setting for high frame rate, when you enable it on this camera, you go there, it only gives you for, let me see, it's 4K DCI at 120, all I, and then 4K UHD 120. Those are the only options you see. So hold on, not sure if there's anything else, but if you see it right there, it's not in focus, but that's the high frame rate option. It's only that on the R5. So it's 4K 120 all I for slow motion. So there's no 1080p version, there's no 720 version. It's just 4K 120, straight and foremost. I'm probably seeing that right, but I'm not sure if there's anything hidden that I don't know of, but it looks like that's clear as day. That's 120, it's 4K 120 all I on the R5.
I'll just echo what Kevin said. 120p is the fastest frame rate that these cameras can shoot, at least at the time of their introduction. In the case of the R5, as Kevin just said, it's 4K at 120p, 120 frames a second max. And in the case of the R6, it's at full HD, 1080p at 120 frames a second max. We know that there are some competitive cameras that if you're willing to drop the video resolution, you can increase that frames a second rate for very dramatic slow motion and that kind of thing. Honestly, just, gun to my head, it's a feature I'd love to see, but right now we don't have it. 120 frames a second is the fastest frames a second rate we have for video right now on the R5 and the R6.
Rudy, go back to the autofocus coverage, 100% vertical and horizontal autofocus coverage. And again, taking it back to the EF line of lenses, does this change when you're using an EF lens with the mount adapter, or is it still 100%?
It's going to depend on the lens. There are going to be some lenses that are not going to give you the full, basically 100 by 100 coverage. And you may see that, especially when you go to face detect plus tracking, you'll get a little white borderline as a reference. I'm not talking about that little white border that appears during high-speed electronic shutter shooting. But you get little white kind of brackets in the corners that are indicating the active frame area, the active autofocus areas, I mean to say. And it's smart enough to know the lens you have on the camera. Some of the lenses are not going to give you that full 100 by 100% coverage when you're in face detect plus tracking. And that can happen with certain EF lenses, and certain EF lenses will give you that. I don't have the list in front of me of which ones will and which ones won't. I know that's the follow-up question. But you'll know when you attach one, you'll know right away. It's not going to be, that I got to try and, see if it'll do it or something. You'll see the little white brackets in the corners that just indicate the coverage. And I should mention this too, just so that we're clear on it. For technical reasons, the two new super telephoto lenses that we just announced, the RF 600mm f11 and 800mm f11, for technical reasons, the coverage is going to drop to it's not just like a central focusing point in the middle of the frame and that's it. But you'll see that the cluster of focusing points available, even in face detect plus tracking, is going to be much more centralized. It can't go out all the way to the corners like it could on a more conventional RF and some EF lenses.
Rudy, I wanted to talk about, stick with that right there. We had people asking about third-party lenses. So Douglas has a Tamron. For people who haven't moved up to the R line of lenses, or people who do not even shoot Canon, they're thinking about switching over to Canon and use third-party lenses. Are you getting, is there anything that these people should be aware of? Are they getting the same benefits from a third-party lens as if they're using the EF or RF lenses?
This is one of these areas that we never have, actual empirical information from our engineers. Our engineers don't work with other lens companies and so on. It's up to other lens companies to basically reverse engineer their products to work on our cameras. And anytime we introduce a new camera, or, in some cases, like with EOS R, a new system, there's obviously going to be a lot of new communication protocols and so on. So while anybody can take an EF mount lens, Canon brand or otherwise, use the Canon mount adapter, the EF to EOS R mount adapter, and any of the 3 mount adapters, and physically put it on. Whether it's going to work or not is going to just depend on a host of factors that are basically outside of Canon's ability to deal with. So they may very well work fine. And if they do, cool. You know, keep, you know, rock and roll, keep right on using it. It may be that you find all of a sudden that, you know, some things aren't working as effectively or maybe not at all. And if that's the case, you know, with a third-party lens that you're mounting on an EOS R series camera and with the Canon mount adapter, if it's the case that it's, you know, not working with that third-party lens, you're basically in a situation where, you know, you need to go to the lens manufacturer and say, okay, look, I tried it with this Canon setup and it didn't work. What do I need to do? You know, because, you know, the thing we can guarantee is that you can take a Canon brand EF lens or EFS lens and use it with the mount adapters seamlessly. And that can be a lens as old as the lenses that first came out for the EOS system back in 1987.
Okay. And Kevin, we had some questions coming on Facebook asking about memory cards in particular. So again, we keep talking about faster processing. With faster processing and write speeds, you need faster read speeds on your memory cards. So is there, you know, if somebody goes out and upgrades their camera system, so say somebody goes out and upgrades to an R5 and an R6, are they going to have to then upgrade their memory cards?
It depends what they're coming from. If they're going to R6 and they're coming from a camera that uses SD cards, they're fine. The R6 has dual SD card slots, UHS-2 compatible, so you could use those faster cards, but if you have the UHS-1 cards, which are just one row of contacts, it'll work. Obviously not as quick, but the thing is the UHS-2 gives you better speed. As far as the R5, 2 card slots once again, but one of them is a CF Express card, which is a new type of card. It uses the XQD basically form factor. It's a little bit more open source, and you see a lot of manufacturers come out with it now. It's not, just because it has a term CF in it, it's not a compact flash card at all. It's not a CFS card at all. It's a totally different card. I'll show you what it looks like. Popping it up over here. It is this small one. This is a SanDisk one. It is basically, the real name of it is CF Express Type B. There's going to be 2 other types, but those aren't out yet. But this is called a Type B CF Express card. So if you're going to do that 8K RAW, you're going to need one of these cards, and you're going to need a big one. Keep that in mind when you're laying it out and you're, you know, breaking open your piggy bank and trying to get going to get the R5. If you're going to do 8K, you need a big one of these, because I think a 256 only gets you 13 minutes, if I'm not mistaken. So
Correct.
obviously, yeah, so good. So basically, oops, I just popped out a card. But other than that, yeah, CF Express, if you're going to do the higher 4K and the 8K on the R5. Anything else, the SD cards will work. If you do anything 20 frames a second, you want to do the quicker ones, obviously, because that'll help the buffer out. And if anybody wants to see I showed it before, but this is a UHS Type 2 card, 2 rows of contacts right there. They get better, basically, more lanes on the highway for better speeds. That's what that's for.
Let me just expand on that for a second. And I'm not trying to put the fear of God into anybody, but once again, you know, I'll say we're trying to be transparent and straightforward in managing people's expectations and so on with these 2 extremely exciting cameras. 8K video recording capability absolutely puts pedal to the metal in terms of card requirements. And it's not enough. And I'm certainly not saying Kevin was mistaken in anything he said. Don't get me wrong. But, you know, some people may walk away with, oh, okay, well, if I just get a CF Express card, I'm fine. For 8K raw recording, you are going to need a CF Express card, irrespective of its actual capacity for how long you can record. You are going to need a card with a minimum of 400 megabytes per second write speeds. Not read speeds, write speeds. And that information sometimes is right on the card, sometimes it's not. But you're going to need a fast CF Express card, not just the least expensive one that you were able to pick up online from some offshore supplier or something for 8K RAW. For 8K All-I, you're going to need a CF Express with a minimum of 200 megabytes per second read speeds, or write speeds, excuse me. And then you're going to also need, for 4K 120 frames a second, once again, a CF Express card with 400 megabytes per second write speeds. So, you know, we get it. We're talking the high price spread here in terms of the cards that are going to be needed for people that are doing the very high end video recording. There's a lot of information. These are big files and a lot of processing going on, and it isn't enough to just say, I got CF Express, I'm fine. They got to be high end CF Express if you're doing 8K or 4K at 120p.
Rudy, wow. I told you I was going to say wow a lot. I tried to keep it to a minimum here. Can't thank you guys enough. Kevin, obviously from B&H, broadcasting live from the B&H Superstore. So again, we are open. Come back, say hi, check out these cameras once we have them in store for yourself. On behalf of Canon and B&H, Rudy, thank you so much. You were a wealth of knowledge today. Rudy, it's only right to end this thing with a Rudy chant. You did such an amazing job. I mean, these are amazing cameras. And we touched upon lenses, really taking the older generation of Canon, upgrading upon it, and, you know, taking some of the old, mixing it with the new, just really did a great job. To anybody who didn't get any of their questions answered, we do apologize. We tried to extend this and get as much information in your hands as possible. But there is a wealth of knowledge out there on the internet. Rudy, is there any place in particular you want to direct people if they do have any additional questions?
We have on the Canon USA website, there's, you know, a lot of preliminary information. And I mean, obviously, to anybody who's photo savvy nowadays, there's going to be plenty of third-party information that's going to start becoming available, he tried to say. Right now, a lot of it still falls into the realm of sort of like informed speculation. But I think that once cameras start to get out to actual web reviewers, and I think, you know, your customers kind of have an idea of some of the you know, figures we're talking about, you're going to find a heck of a lot of impartial information out there that'll answer, you know, many of the questions you have, including some detailed ones about these two cameras. But boy, are we excited. This is just, it's like I said at the beginning, I've been at Canon for 23 years now. It's been a wonderful ride, but we've never had a magic carpet ride like this. And we're really looking forward, even with all the down stuff that 2020 has brought to our nation and to the world. We are really looking forward to what the second half of 2020 is going to bring for us and for the photographic community, and certainly what lies beyond.
Yeah, this is definitely an exciting announcement for the photo community at large. And again, information-wise, like I said, the Superstore is open. We have plenty of intelligent women and men like Kevin who are going to be in the store to help you out. And really, our job at B&H is to educate you. You know, the most educated customer that we can create is the best customer that we can have. And we really do want to put the knowledge into your hands, because let's face it, there are no bad cameras out there. There's only the right camera for you and the camera that may not be as right for you. So on behalf of Canon and B&H, Rudy, Kevin, thank you guys both so much for joining us. On behalf of everybody watching, thank you for your questions, and thank you for always viewing and staying with B&H. So on behalf of all of us here, thank you. This has been another rendition of the B&H virtual event space with a special Canon announcement. We'll see you all next time.